Backpacking has always been a big part of my life. For years, I chased the trails, packed my bag, and went deep into the mountains, always chasing the quiet, the wild, and the chance to test myself against nature. I've had countless trips, some beautiful, some challenging, but the scariest moments I've ever faced out there weren't from wild animals or getting lost or any of the usual outdoor dangers. No, the thing that truly scared me to my core, that made me feel utterly small and powerless, was lightning. I remember my first real run-in with it like it was yesterday, even though it was years ago. I was at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, which is one of those legendary backpacking spots for scouts. The land there is rugged, wild, and vast. It's a place that makes you feel alive in a way few others can. During the day, the sun burns hot and bright, and at night the stars stretch out endlessly. We were deep in the backcountry, hiking and camping, the days full of miles on the trail and the nights around campfires. It was everything a scout trip should be. One evening, after a long day of hiking, my group settled into a small clearing to eat dinner. The sky was a strange mix of dark, brooding clouds and patches of sunlight shining through. I remember thinking it was an odd sky, the kind that makes you feel like something is about to change, but no one said much. We were hungry and tired, ready to eat and get some rest. Then it happened. Without warning, lightning struck a tree about 50 feet away from us. The blast was brutal and immediate. The tree exploded with a sound like a cannon going off, splintering and cracking. Shards of wood and bark flew through the air as the lightning ripped through the trunk. The ground beneath us shook, and for a moment, all of us froze in place, stunned and wide-eyed. The noise was deafening, the smell of burnt wood sharp in the air. Dinner went flying everywhere, our carefully prepared food dumped into the dirt. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I remember my hands trembling as I grabbed my pack, ready to move just in case the storm decided to get closer. That flash of white-hot light, the roar of thunder that seemed to tear the sky apart. It was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Up to that point, storms had been something you could sit out or hide from, but that moment made it clear how small and vulnerable I really was. We didn't get much more sleep that night. Every crack of thunder kept me alert, every flash of lightning making my stomach twist. That strike was close enough to remind me how fast and furious a storm could be. And over the next 2 weeks, the storms came and went, always chasing us, never letting us forget. But nothing compared to what happened months later on the Ray Lakes Trail in Kings Canyon, California. That trip, that night, is something I still replay in my mind, and I don't think I ever will forget the way fear took over me. The raw power of nature pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. We had been hiking for days, moving slowly through the granite peaks and deep valleys of the Sierra Nevada. The air was crisp, cold even, and the beauty of the landscape was breathtaking. Jagged rocks, pine forests, rivers that cut through the valley floors like silver ribbons. It was the kind of place you dream about when you want to escape the noise of everyday life. That day, we reached a campsite by a river nestled in a tight granite valley. The site was beautiful but a little unsettling. The valley walls were steep and closed in all around, and you could see how the river carved through the rocks, cutting deep into the earth. There were clear signs that this spot had flooded in the past, especially after heavy rains. Still, it was the designated National Park Service site, so we figured it was safe enough to spend the night. I set up my tent near the riverbank, listening to the constant murmur of water rushing over rocks. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, fresh and alive. As the evening wore on, dark clouds gathered overhead. It was the kind of sky that makes you stop and take notice, the clouds thick, heavy, almost black. A storm was coming. We ate quickly and retreated into our tents, trying to get some rest before the worst hit. Sleep was uneasy, the air thick with anticipation. Then, at around 2 in the morning, everything changed. A flash of lightning struck with a brightness so intense I swear I could see the inside of my tent through my closed eyelids. The light was pure white, almost burning, followed immediately by a thunderclap so loud and close it shook the ground beneath me. The sound wasn't just thunder. It was like the earth was ripping open, tearing itself apart. The roar lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then came the rain. The sky opened up and poured down torrents of water. The thunder didn't stop rolling across the valley. It kept coming in waves that rolled over the granite walls and echoed endlessly. The lightning strikes were constant, each flash so bright it turned the night into day, showing the forest and river outside in stark detail even through the thin walls of my tent. I could see trees bending under the force of the wind, the river swelling and rushing with more urgency than before. I lay there frozen, every nerve alive with fear, knowing the river was rising and could flood the site at any moment. I was caught between two deadly threats: the chance of being struck by lightning in the open or being swept away if the river burst its banks. The hours dragged on. Every lightning flash was like a warning shot, a reminder that nature was beyond control. I could hear the rain pounding on the tent, the wind whipping the fabric, the thunder crashing so loud I thought it might burst my eardrums. Sleep was impossible. I was soaked, cold, and terrified, but there was nowhere to go. The storm had me trapped. When dawn finally came, the storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The valley was quiet except for the swollen river, which raged louder than ever, carving deeper into the rocks. The campsite was soaked, everything covered in mud and debris. We packed up quickly, shaken and exhausted, eager to leave that narrow valley behind. That night was the closest I ever came to feeling like nature might actually kill me. My third close encounter with lightning was in the Swiss Alps, high up on a descent through a rocky field. The air was thinner, colder, and even the sun seemed weaker. We were miles from shelter, caught in an open space with nothing but stones and sparse grass. A storm rolled in fast, black clouds sweeping across the sky like a dark tide. The first flashes came before the rain, bright lines splitting the sky and striking dangerously close. There was no cover, no trees, no cabin, just us crouched low against the cold rocks, praying silently. The lightning strikes came closer and closer, each one shaking the earth and lighting up the night with jagged bolts. The wind howled and the rain started, cold and sharp against my skin. I remember feeling completely exposed, vulnerable in a way I never had before. We stayed there for what felt like hours, just waiting and hoping the storm would move on. I kept my head low, my body tense, heart hammering. I felt like any second the sky could open up and end everything. Those 3 experiences have stayed with me over the years. I still love the mountains, the wilderness, the quiet moments watching the world breathe around me. But whenever I see the first dark clouds gathering or hear the distant rumble of thunder, something inside me shifts. A primal part of me wakes up and screams at me to find shelter, to get indoors, to hide from the sky. There's something humbling and terrifying about lightning. Its raw power made visible, a reminder that no matter how skilled or prepared you think you are, you're just a small part of a vast, unpredictable world. It can strike without warning, it can change everything in an instant, and you can do nothing but wait. After those trips, I always made sure to respect storms and never underestimate how dangerous they are. I learned to watch the skies, to read the wind, to seek shelter early. Because when you're out there, far from help, the sky is the one thing you can't control, and lightning is the one thing that can stop you cold, no matter how strong or brave you think you are. Now, when I camp, I always carry that memory with me. The crack of thunder that made my ears ring, the blinding flash that froze me in place, the pounding rain that soaked me to the bone. I've seen what lightning can do, and I know the mountain can turn deadly in an instant. And that's the real story. Not about ghosts or legends, but about the power of nature itself. The wild, unstoppable force that humbles us all. When the sky lights up and the world shakes beneath your feet. The sun had barely risen when we gathered in front of my house, ready for our annual camping trip. It was the 1st of May, the day we always marked for our tradition, and this year was no different. We'd been planning it for weeks, each of us contributing to the usual haul of food, drinks, and camping gear. As always, a few of us stopped by the convenience store to grab some beer for the road. The plan was simple: head to the same camping spot we'd been to a dozen times, deep in the woods, set up camp, and drink until the sun went down. It was the kind of trip where we could just let loose, have fun, and forget about everything else for a while. By 5 a.m., everyone was packed into the car, bags full of stuff, and our spirits were high. It was still chilly outside, and the sun hadn't quite come up yet, but it didn't matter. We were used to the early mornings, the long drive, and the excitement of reaching our destination. It was tradition, and no matter what, we kept it. We drove through the countryside, the roads lined with the kind of greenery that always made me feel at ease. We passed the town and headed further out, deeper into the forest. When we finally reached the campsite, it was still relatively quiet. A few other cars were parked nearby, people unloading their gear and setting up their own spots. But we didn't pay them much attention. Everyone else was there for the same thing, enjoying the outdoors and having a good time. The sun was starting to warm the air as we set up our tents. We got a fire going, the smoke rising into the clear sky, and cracked open the first beers of the day. As usual, the whole group was in high spirits, laughing, joking, and just enjoying the moment. The spot we picked was nestled in the woods, just far enough from the other campers to feel like we had some privacy. But even so, we could still hear faint music in the distance from the other side of the campsite. It was nothing unusual, just some people playing music to keep themselves entertained, like we were. Hours passed. The day turned into late afternoon, and we found ourselves with empty cans scattered around the campfire. The music from the other campers had been playing pretty steadily throughout the day, but as the sun started to dip behind the trees around 7 or 8 p.m., the music suddenly stopped. First, we thought nothing of it. We figured the people near us were just winding down for the night, maybe getting some sleep. It wasn't uncommon for people to pack up and leave on the night of May 1st since most of them were only there for the day. But we were staying for the whole weekend. Around that time, one of my friends, Jake, said he was going to go over and ask if anyone had a lighter. We'd forgotten to bring one, and he thought it wouldn't hurt to check with the nearby campers. He wandered off in the direction of where the music had been, but when he came back a few minutes later, he looked kind of surprised. "They're gone," he said, shaking his head. "I went over there, and no one's around. Everything's packed up. They must have left early." We all stood there for a moment, trying to process what he said. It didn't make sense. Normally, people stuck around at least until the 2nd of May, and we'd never seen anyone leave that early. But we shrugged it off. Maybe they just had somewhere else to be. Jake found a lighter, and we got the fire going again. It was starting to get dark now, the kind of dark where the trees almost swallowed up the light, and the air had that cool, crisp edge to it. We cracked open more beers and kept talking, trying not to think too much about the weirdness of the situation. The night carried on as normal, the sound of our laughter and conversation filling the space around us. But around 10 p.m., something changed. We heard it at first, a faint sound off in the distance, something like a giggle, the high-pitched laughter of girls playing in the woods. It wasn't unusual to hear people messing around in the dark, but the way it sounded made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound like normal laughter. It was distorted, like something was off, and it wasn't just the laughter. We started hearing footsteps, quick, light steps, like someone was running through the forest. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. It didn't make sense. There was no one around, and even if there had been, no one would have been running like that in the woods. Felt wrong. "What the hell was that?" someone asked. "It's probably just some drunk people screwing around," Jake said, trying to brush it off. "Let's just keep drinking." We passed the beers around again, the laughter coming easier now as we tried to ignore the strange sounds. But the noises didn't stop. The running footsteps grew closer, and the laughter kept echoing through the trees, each time a little more distant, but still there. We'd drunk enough to feel pretty buzzed by now, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Something didn't sit right about it. At this point, everyone was on edge, trying to act casual but feeling uneasy. The air around us felt thicker, like the forest had become a different place altogether. Then, we heard something even worse. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming towards us from the trees. They weren't fast or light like the running from earlier. These were slow, deliberate steps, like someone or something was walking toward us. Everyone immediately tensed up. We grabbed anything we could find, shovels, knives, sticks, and we prepared ourselves. We didn't know what we were going to face, but we weren't going to be caught off guard. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. We waited, hearts pounding in our chests, the crackling fire the only sound in the air. I swear, for a moment the whole forest went quiet. There was no sound of wind, no rustling of leaves, just absolute silence. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. But then, the silence was broken by a snap of a twig somewhere to our left. We all jumped, our eyes darting to the darkness. We stood there for a long time, listening. The footsteps didn't return. It wasn't until we started to settle down again that we heard them once more, coming from the edge of the camp. They were getting closer. We all stood up, ready to fight whatever was out there. But again, nothing came. The footsteps stopped just out of view, and no one emerged. We kept quiet, waiting in the dark. We knew there was something out there, but whatever it was staying just far enough away that we couldn't see it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the laughter, everything. It all went quiet. By the time we decided to try to get some sleep, we were all exhausted, but the tension in the air didn't let up. We lay in our tents, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the only thing that kept us from thinking too much about what had happened. Still, no one slept well that night. Every little noise had us on edge. A branch breaking, a distant snap of a twig. It all made us jump. When the morning came, we were all awake before the sun even rose. We were too afraid to stay in the tents any longer, and we all piled out, looking around. But there was no sign of anyone. No one had been there. The campsite was as quiet as it had been when we first arrived, and the tracks we thought we'd seen in the ground were gone. We looked for signs of whoever or whatever had been around us, but there was nothing. No footprints, no traces, just the quiet of the forest. As we packed up to leave, none of us said much. We all knew what we had experienced, and though we couldn't explain it, we were all shaken. That night, whatever had been in the woods with us wasn't human, and we were lucky that it didn't come any closer. To this day, we've never talked about it much. Maybe we were all just drunk, maybe we heard things that weren't there, but something happened that night, and none of us will ever forget it. Even now, I can't help but wonder if we were just a little too close to something we shouldn't have been. The late afternoon sun was dipping low when we arrived at the camping spot. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that stretched far and wide, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The ground was soft and covered with pine needles, a faint smell of damp earth and moss lingering in the air. The place was quiet except for the distant call of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. The kind of quiet that felt deep, like it was hiding something just beneath the surface. We set up the tents on the edge of the clearing, close enough to the forest so that we could hear it breathing, but far enough to have a clear view of the sky. I worked slowly, careful with the tent poles and stakes, feeling the tension in my fingers as I hammered them into the ground. The other campers moved around, collecting firewood and sorting gear, but I stayed quiet, letting the calm of the place settle over me. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the forest began to change. Shadows lengthened and darkened until the whole area was wrapped in a thick twilight. The air cooled, and the smell of pine grew stronger, mixed now with the faint scent of wet earth. The wind whispered softly through the branches, sending tiny twigs and dry leaves to skitter across the ground. I started a fire in the pit we had dug earlier. The flame crackled and spat, throwing flickering orange light on the nearby trees. The warmth was comforting against the chill that had settled in the air. The others gathered around, roasting marshmallows and sharing snacks. I sat back, watching the fire dance, listening to the sounds of the night slowly waking up. Birds stopped singing, replaced by the occasional call of an owl somewhere deep in the woods. The wind shifted and picked up, making the branches overhead creak and groan. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped sharply. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals moved through the forest all the time, but the sound was close enough to pull my attention. The sky above was clear now, dotted with stars that twinkled softly. The The Milky Way stretched out like a pale river across the darkness. The firelight made the shadows move in strange, flickering shapes that played tricks on the eyes. The woods around us felt alive and watchful. After the fire had burned low, I decided to walk a little deeper into the forest, just to stretch my legs and breathe in the night air. I told no one. The others were busy cleaning up and preparing to sleep. The moment I stepped beyond the clearing, the temperature dropped noticeably. The forest felt thicker here, the trees closer together, their trunks rough and dark in the moonlight. I moved slowly, my footsteps soft against the layer of needles and dry leaves. The silence was almost total, broken only by my breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. My eyes tried to adjust to the dark, but everything was just shapes and shadows. I felt a quiet tension growing inside me, a sense that I wasn't alone. I wasn't afraid yet, just alert, sensing something shifting in the woods. Then I heard it. A heavy breath, close and steady, coming from somewhere to my right. I froze. The breath was slow, deep, almost deliberate. I strained my eyes, scanning the darkness between the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The breath stopped, then started again, louder this time, and there was movement. A slow, deliberate step. I didn't run immediately. Part of me wanted to see what it was, to know what was out there. The other part screamed at me to get back to the camp. The steps grew louder and heavier. I could hear the brush rustling as something large moved closer. My heart was pounding now, my hands trembling slightly. I turned and started walking back toward the clearing, my pace quickening with every step. The breaths followed me, heavy and close, but I didn't look back. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blurring into dark shapes. The firelight was nowhere in sight. I could hear the others, faint voices carried by the wind, but they felt far away. Suddenly, a large shape blocked my path. I stopped dead, my breath caught in my throat. It was dark and massive, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. The shape moved slowly, circling me. I could hear the soft crack of branches under its weight. I knew it wasn't a person. It wasn't a deer or a small animal. It was something bigger, heavier, something that didn't belong near the camp. I slowly raised my hand, trying not to show panic. I fumbled for the flashlight I had in my jacket pocket, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on. A sharp beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the animal. Its eyes caught the beam, glowing faintly red, reflecting back at me. It was a bear. The bear was close, too close, its massive body tense and still. It watched me silently, breathing heavily. I could see the scars on its face, the ragged fur around its neck. It was neither aggressive nor calm. It was simply there, watching, deciding what to do. I knew that sudden moves could provoke it, but standing frozen wasn't much better. Slowly, I started backing away, keeping my light trained on the bear. The ground was uneven, and my foot caught on a root, making me stumble. The bear let out a low grunt and shifted forward. My heart pounded so loud it felt like it might burst. I managed to scramble to my feet and continued backing away, shouting loudly to scare it off. The bear hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the trees with a heavy rustle. I didn't stop moving until I was back in the clearing, safe among the tents and the warm glow of the dying fire. My chest heaved as I collapsed on the ground, my hands still shaking. The others looked at me with wide eyes, asking without words what had happened. I told them about the bear and how close it had come. We quickly checked the camp for anything that might attract the animal. Food scraps, garbage, anything with a smell. We moved everything into sealed containers and made sure the fire was still burning. None of us spoke much after that. The night felt different now, heavier, more dangerous. We stayed close together, taking turns keeping watch until dawn. Every sound made me jump. A snapping branch, a distant howl, the whisper of wind through the trees. But the bear did not return. When morning finally came, the forest looked calm and peaceful again. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting warm light on the ground. The night's fear faded slowly, replaced by relief and tiredness. We packed up quickly after breakfast, leaving the clearing behind. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bear watching us go. But there was nothing there, just the quiet woods stretching out under a clear blue sky. The experience stayed with me for a long time. It reminded me how wild and unpredictable nature can be, how easily things can change from calm to dangerous. I never forgot the weight of those glowing eyes in the dark, or the slow, heavy breath just inches away. I learned that night to respect the woods and its creatures, to be prepared, and to never underestimate how close danger can come, even when you think you're safe. That camping trip ended without injury, but it left a mark, a real reminder that the wild is alive, and it's always watching. It was supposed to be a simple Girl Scout trip. Nothing too serious, nothing too out of the ordinary. Just a weekend camping trip with a bunch of my classmates. All of us in our junior high uniforms, ready for a little outdoor adventure. My school had set it up, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting much more than the usual. A little hiking, a campfire, maybe some ghost stories, nothing that would stick with me forever. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, a large open area in the middle of a military base. The base was old, probably decades old, with a few weathered buildings scattered around, but it had that kind of charm that old places have. The trees surrounding us were tall and dense, their branches thick enough to block out most of the sky, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I remember the sounds too, the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional distant clank of something metal, probably from the old equipment left behind. The day was a blur of activities. Some of us worked on knots, others learned to cook over a fire, and then there were those who spent time hiking around the area. It wasn't until later that evening, just as the sun was setting and the air started to cool, that things started to feel different. Our supervisor, Ms. Hartley, a tall woman with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude, gathered us all together. She told us it was time for a night walk through the forest trail. Everyone was a bit reluctant. I mean, we were all a bit uneasy in the dark, but it wasn't the dark itself that was the problem. It was the stories. Ms. Hartley was famous for telling creepy stories to get us hyped up, but she really went all in this time. The quality of the microphone she used was awful. Static crackled and distorted most of what she said, but she still managed to get her point across. I don't remember all of it, but there was something about soldiers from the old military base, how they used to patrol these woods, and how some of them never came back. There were stories about strange sounds in the night, and how some people thought they saw things moving just outside the range of their flashlights. It wasn't exactly terrifying, but it was enough to make everyone feel a little uneasy, especially since we were walking through the woods at night, with only our flashlights to guide the way. We began our hike, a long line of girls walking silently, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching against the forest floor and the occasional murmur from someone ahead of me. I stayed near the back of the group, mostly because I wasn't in the mood to be close to anyone. Besides, the further I was from the front, the less I could hear of the ongoing conversation. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the trail ahead, the flickering beams of light dancing in front of my feet. But then something happened that threw me off. A scream, a loud, sharp scream that echoed through the trees. The girls in the front of the line jumped back in panic, their voices rising in a chorus of whispers and gasps. We all froze for a second, waiting for something, anything to happen. My heart started racing. Was it one of the stories Ms. Hartley had told us? Was it one of the soldiers she mentioned coming back to haunt us? I felt a chill run down my spine. Then, from up ahead, someone shouted, "It's okay. It's just me." It was Ms. Hartley. She had somehow disappeared from the front of the group and was now standing at the far side of the path. I don't know how she got there, or when exactly she left her position, but she was standing in front of us, smiling. We all sighed in relief. A few of the girls let out nervous laughs. "You scared the hell out of us," someone called out, half laughing, half shaken. "I didn't mean to," Ms. Hartley called back. She sounded amused, but also a little apologetic. "But it's all part of the adventure, right?" At that point, we all shrugged it off. It was just a little scare, nothing to worry about. We'd split up after that, heading towards the meeting point near the campfire. But the whole group was still a bit on edge. There were jokes and giggles, but I noticed something strange as we walked. Ms. Hartley was with us again, but something didn't feel right. Maybe it was because she had just appeared out of nowhere, or maybe it was the way she looked at us. But there was this lingering feeling in the air that I couldn't shake. When we finally reached the meeting point, we saw another supervisor standing there, Ms. Hartley's colleague, a woman named Mrs. Daniels. She was standing near the fire, looking completely calm, as though she had been there for a while. But that wasn't what caught everyone's attention. The weird part was Ms. Hartley was still with us. She was standing near the back of the group, chatting quietly with one of the girls, as though she had never left. The girls who had been talking to her before froze. They turned to Mrs. Daniels, then back to Ms. Hartley. A few of them started to whisper, exchanging confused looks. "Didn't Ms. Hartley just show up with us?" one of them asked. "Wasn't she ahead of us the whole time?" We all started talking amongst ourselves, wondering if we had missed something. The whole thing seemed strange, like a trick or some sort of prank. But why would she play a prank on us? It didn't make sense. "Wait a minute." One of the girls spoke up, turning to Ms. Hartley. "When did you get here? How did you end up with us?" Ms. Hartley laughed, brushing it off like it was nothing. "Oh, I've been here for a long time now. You must not have noticed." We all stared at her, unsure of what to say. No one knew what to make of it. Why had she said that? And if she'd been there for a while, why hadn't anyone seen her earlier? The conversation died down, and some of us wandered off to sit around the campfire. Others went to get something to drink, still talking in hushed voices. It felt like a strange shift in the atmosphere, like something wasn't quite right, but we couldn't put our finger on it. Then, as the night wore on, a few of us went back to Ms. Hartley, asking her more about what had happened. We were still curious, even though we didn't really expect an answer. She told us that she hadn't left the spot we had last seen her. In fact, she had been there the entire time. She looked at us, confused, as if we had misunderstood. "But we saw you earlier," one of my friends insisted. "You were with us at the front of the group and then you weren't. You popped up later like you were following us." Ms. Hartley shook her head. "No, I've been right here. I don't know what you're talking about." It didn't make sense. It was like she was denying the fact that she'd been somewhere else just a few minutes ago. Was she messing with us? But why would she? This wasn't the time for pranks. We were on a serious trip, not some joke at the expense of our nerves. The conversation ended, and eventually, we all split up to head to our tents. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about it. What if Ms. Hartley wasn't lying? What if something had happened, and we didn't see it? Maybe she had been there all along, and we just hadn't noticed. Maybe we'd all been caught up in the moment, the excitement and tension of the hike, and our brains had just played tricks on us. But it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the kind of thing that could easily be explained away. Something about the way Ms. Hartley had acted, the way she had just appeared, felt strange. Maybe it was a simple misunderstanding. Maybe we were just overthinking it. But then again, what if we weren't? The sun had long disappeared behind the thick ridges of the Southern California mountains when the woods around the camp grew quiet, except for the faint rustling of leaves and distant coyote howls. I was working as a counselor at this camp, deep in the forest where the air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the night sky was a blanket of stars like I'd never seen in the city. The camp itself felt like a world apart. Out here, you were never really alone. Deer would slip silently through the underbrush, foxes darted between trees, and every now and then, someone spotted a mountain lion lurking just beyond the far edges of the camp. The woods were beautiful but wild, and the camp's old cabins were scattered among shadows and whispers of the past. Some spots carried a strange vibe, places where you could almost feel the weight of things long gone, where people said the land had stories and maybe secrets, but nothing we could ever quite put our finger on. That night, after putting my campers to bed, I stepped outside the cabin to cool off. The air was crisp, the kind that made your breath come out in little clouds. I stood with another counselor, just chatting quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest. Coyotes yipping in the distance, leaves crunching somewhere nearby. The camp was peaceful in a way that felt both calming and unsettling, like you were part of something much bigger but also much darker. Suddenly, Sadie came sprinting down the path, her face pale and wide-eyed. Behind her trailed her entire teenage girls' cabin, about 12 of them, all dressed in black from head to toe, moving fast and looking terrified. Sadie was usually one of the calmest counselors I knew, always rational, never one to jump at shadows or let fear get the better of her. But that night, she was a different person. She barreled right past us without slowing down, shouting over her shoulder that she thought she'd heard a ghost and that once her campers were asleep, she'd meet me back by my cabin to explain everything and try to figure out what was going on. I stayed rooted for a moment, watching the group hurry away into the darkness, their black clothes blending with the night. The way they moved, so tense, so panicked, set a knot in my stomach. Ghosts weren't something I believed in, but something about the way Sadie looked shook me. This wasn't just campfire storytelling or a silly prank gone wrong. About 30 minutes later, when the campers were finally quiet and the forest had settled into its deep night rhythm again, Sadie showed up at my cabin. Her breathing was still heavy from running, her face flushed from the adrenaline. She told me about the night hike she had taken with her group. It had started out as a fun idea. She'd made the campers dress all in black and pretend to be ninjas, sneaking through the woods trying to be quiet and blend into the shadows. It was supposed to be a game, a way to get them moving and laughing before bed, to feel brave and adventurous. The girls had loved it, sneaking around tree trunks, whispering and darting between shadows. But then, on their way back to camp, they passed a spot on the trail that was darker than the rest. A patch of thick forest where the canopy closed tightly overhead, blocking out even the moonlight. Just beyond the tree line, they heard it. Faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. Then louder. A small, desperate voice calling help. It sounded like a child. Sadie said the voice was clear enough that everyone stopped and listened. But each time it came, the sound twisted and warped, growing more distorted and unnatural. It started to sound less like a child's voice and more like something else entirely, like an animal or something trying to imitate a child but failing horribly. The kids froze, then panic hit. They bolted down the trail, not stopping until they were back in camp. I could feel the tension in her voice as she described it. This wasn't just a prank or a wild animal howling. This was something that rattled everyone, especially Sadie. We decided to be responsible and see what was really going on. We grabbed flashlights and headed toward that part of the trail. The forest was silent except for our footsteps and the steady thrum of night insects. The deeper we went, the thicker the shadows became. When we got close to the spot Sadie described, the air felt heavier, colder somehow. Then we heard it. The sound wasn't faint anymore. It echoed from somewhere just beyond the trees. A long, drawn-out screech that tried to sound like a child screaming for help, but it was shrill, harsh, and unnatural. It didn't come from a single place. It felt like it was all around us, coming from the entire mountain slope, the trees seeming to carry the sound and twist it, like the forest itself was screaming. The sound filled the air and made my skin crawl. Sadie grabbed my arm, and without a word, we turned and ran. Our footsteps pounded on the dirt path as we sprinted back toward camp, the horrible screams fading behind us but never completely disappearing in the silence between. When we finally reached the main camp area, safe under the glow of porch lights and the watchful eyes of the other counselors, we told the story to anyone who would listen. Most just laughed or shook their heads, assuming we were messing with them or imagining things. The next morning, the camp director called a meeting. They told us to reassure the kids that the strange sounds were just bobcats, wild animals that lived in the area and made high-pitched yelping noises at night. Harmless, they said, just nature doing its thing. Everyone was supposed to tell the campers not to be scared. Despite the explanation, Sadie and I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. It didn't sound like any animal we'd heard before. It wasn't just a yelp or a howl. It was something else, something twisted and eerie, like the forest had a dark voice of its own. For the rest of the summer, our friends never let us live it down. They joked about us hearing ghosts or being scared of our own shadows. But deep down, we both knew that night was something we wouldn't forget. The night when the woods seemed to call out in a way no one should ever hear. Even now, thinking back to that moment standing there in the dark, listening to that horrible scream coming from everywhere and nowhere, I feel the weight of those woods pressing in, reminding me that some places hold secrets too wild and strange to explain away. And sometimes it's better not to know what's really out there. That was one of those hot summer days where the air felt thick, like it could smother you if you weren't careful. The kind of day when the sun beats down relentlessly, but there's a quiet, almost lazy breeze that sneaks in every now and then, cool enough that you barely notice it at first, but later, when the sun starts going down, you're thankful for it. We were all at my uncle's place, a house he built himself out on this huge stretch of land, way far from any other houses. I remember someone saying the nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away, and that was probably mostly woods and cow pastures in between. You could see why my uncle loved it out there. His house sat like a hidden gem in the middle of all that space. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid, with weathered wood that had taken on this rich, dark color from years of sun and rain. The deck wrapped all the way around it, wide enough for people to spread out. That deck had become the heart of the party. Kids running around chasing each other, adults sitting in folding chairs or leaning against the railings, some talking, others just watching the kids or sipping cold drinks. The smell of grilled meat lingered in the air, along with the faint scent of grass and wood smoke. Somewhere off in the distance, a cow mooed, and occasionally you could hear a bird calling out before it settled back into the quiet. It was one of those days where everyone just relaxed. The sun was blazing hot, but the breeze kept it from being unbearable. I was hanging out, chatting with some of the cousins, when someone asked me to run into town to pick up more groceries. The party was going strong, but we were running low on ice, drinks, and some last-minute snacks. It felt like a small task, so I grabbed my keys and my jacket and headed out. The dirt road leading from the house was narrow and bumpy, twisting through the trees and past the fields where the cattle grazed. The farther I drove, the quieter it got. The woods closed in tighter around the road. The sun filtered through thick leaves, casting deep shadows that made everything seem darker than it was. I remember the grocery store being almost too bright, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the cold air conditioning a sharp contrast to the heat outside. I moved quickly, grabbing what we needed: ice bags, bottled water, some sodas, chips, and a few other things that were probably forgotten when we first set up. The cashier barely looked up as I paid, and I was soon back on the road. By then, the sky had started to change. The sun was low, the light softer, but the shadows had grown long and stretched across the road like dark fingers. The trip back felt different. The road that seemed so calm earlier now felt like it was closing in around me. The trees looked taller, their branches clawing at the fading light. The only sounds were my car's tires crunching on the gravel and the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the wind. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me or some sign that I wasn't alone. The darkness came fast that time of year, almost like a switch flipped, and by the time I pulled back up to my uncle's house, the sky was completely black. I flipped on my headlights as I rolled down the driveway. That's when I saw it. Sitting right in front of my car, facing the house, was something I didn't expect to see that close, especially with all the people around. A panther. The black shape sat perfectly still, its sleek body outlined by the dim light from my headlights. Its eyes caught the beam and reflected a cold, almost eerie glow. For a moment, it didn't move, just stared straight ahead at the party. It wasn't nervous or scared of the light. It seemed calm, like it belonged there, like it was waiting for something or someone. What froze me was where it had chosen to sit, right near the edge of where all the kids were playing. The panther was perfectly positioned on the border between the noisy, bright party and the dark, quiet woods beyond. It was almost like it was watching them, waiting, studying. I kept the headlights trained on it, heart pounding in my chest. The panther turned its head slightly and glanced back at me, as if acknowledging that it had been seen. Then, almost unbelievably, it let out a breath that sounded like a human sigh, deep, slow, and full of this strange tiredness. It was like it knew I was there, knew it had been caught and didn't care. After that, the panther stood up, stretched its lithe body with a grace that was almost hypnotic, and turned away. It walked calmly into the woods, disappearing almost immediately into the blackness, like a shadow melting into the night. I sat there, frozen behind the wheel, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. For what felt like a long time, I just stared at the spot where it had vanished. The party was still going on behind the house, but it all seemed distant and unreal now. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. A panther, that close, that bold, so near the kids. Eventually, I shook myself out of the trance. I had to get out and warn everyone. But even then, the thought of stepping out of the car and walking toward a group of people with a panther nearby felt like something out of a nightmare. I took a deep breath, grabbed the groceries, and slowly stepped out onto the gravel driveway. The night air hit me, cooler now but still heavy. The sounds of laughter and kids running mixed with the rustling trees and distant cricket calls. I walked toward the house, every shadow suddenly suspicious. I kept glancing back toward where the panther had been, half expecting it to come back or see another one lurking. When I finally reached the deck, the atmosphere was still festive. People didn't seem to notice the darkness pressing in around us. The kids were still running and shouting, chasing each other in circles, unaware of the silent watcher from the woods. I stood there for a moment, heart still pounding, trying to find the right way to tell them all without causing a panic. The last thing anyone needed was to turn a fun evening into chaos. But the truth was clear. That panther had come close, closer than any of us had expected. It had been watching, waiting on the edge of the light and noise, near the children. It was a stark reminder. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, the wild wasn't far away. It was just on the edge of the party, just beyond the deck's railing, waiting. And sometimes it got bold enough to step into the light. I had always wanted to see the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. The jagged peaks, the deep valleys carved by glaciers, the way the rivers sparkled in the afternoon sun. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted to lose myself for a while. A few friends and I planned a backpacking trip for a week, carrying everything we needed on our backs. The plan was simple. Hike in, set camp somewhere deep in the valley, and just be there with nothing but the wilderness around us. The day we reached the valley floor, it was late afternoon. The valley was narrow, surrounded on both sides by steep rocky walls. Those cliffs looked unforgiving, like something carved out by an ancient force. The rocks were jagged and sharp-edged, stacked into chaotic piles as if the earth had been ripped open and then slowly pushed back together. Trees clung to the slopes, mostly fir and pine, but there were patches where the rock was bare and smooth, and I could see scree fields, loose rock that would tumble down at any moment. We picked a flat spot near a small stream that trickled quietly through the valley bottom. The water was cold and clear, the kind you could drink without a filter if you trusted it. We set up our tents in a loose circle, each of us trying to find the most level ground we could. The light was fading quickly. The sun, blocked by the tall valley walls, disappeared earlier here than it would have in the open. The air cooled fast, and a sharp breeze came down from the cliffs, rustling the trees. Dinner was quiet. We all ate without much talk, probably tired from the day's hike and soaking in the quiet around us. No phones, no distractions, just the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the night. I remember looking up at the sky before crawling into my tent. The stars were unbelievably bright, more than I'd ever seen in the city, scattered thick like salt sprinkled over black velvet. I fell asleep easily, worn out from the day's hike. Then, in the middle of the night, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. It sounded like a distant rumble, low and deep, the kind of sound you might hear far away during a thunderstorm. But there was no thunder. As my mind cleared, I realized it wasn't distant at all. It was close. The sound grew louder, sharper, like huge stones smashing against trees and each other as they tumbled downhill. The valley walls echoed the noise, amplifying the sound and making it impossible to ignore. It wasn't one rock falling. It was a whole chain of them, crashing, breaking, rolling. Trees cracked and snapped as the boulders crushed everything in their path. I felt my heart pound hard in my chest. The ground seemed to shake with every heavy thud. I couldn't see anything. My tent was black inside, and outside it was pitch dark. The valley walls blocked out the moon and any starlight. I thought about running out, maybe to get somewhere safer, but there was nowhere to run. The valley was narrow, and the rocks could be coming from either side. Even if I got out of my tent, I wouldn't be able to see where the rocks were falling. It would be like running blind into a thunderstorm of giant stones. There was no safe path, no clear direction to escape. I lay still, frozen in place, breathing hard and listening to the chaos outside. The noise came closer and closer, the sound of smashing wood and stone getting louder. My mind raced, imagining giant boulders crashing into the camp, breaking tents and crushing everything. I pictured the valley walls shaking, small rocks and dust falling on us even if the big boulders missed. Time stretched out, seconds feeling like minutes. I was trapped in that dark, cramped space, helpless. I kept telling myself it was just nature doing what it does, that rock slides happen all the time in mountains like this. It wasn't anything unusual or special, just dangerous. But knowing that didn't stop the fear. After what felt like forever, the noise slowly began to fade. The crashes got quieter, then almost stopped. Silence returned, except for the steady rush of the stream nearby and the wind through the trees. I didn't move for a while, not sure if it was safe to come out yet. When the sky started to lighten with the first hint of dawn, I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My friends were all out too, looking around with tired, worried faces. We checked the camp for damage. Everything was exactly as we left it. No broken tents, no smashed gear, no rocks anywhere near our site. It was like the rock slide had passed far above us, or maybe off to the side. We walked around the edges of the valley looking for signs of the rocks. There were no large boulders near the camp, no trees knocked down. I could see the steep slopes on both sides, and sure enough, there were small piles of loose rock and some broken branches higher up. Probably the source of the noise, but it was hard to believe how close the rock slide had felt. That feeling of helplessness, lying in the dark with no way to escape, stuck with me. It was unsettling. Out there in the wild, you are small and powerless, completely at the mercy of the land. No matter how prepared you think you are, the mountains have their own plans. The rest of the trip went by slowly after that. We stayed alert, scanning the cliffs each time we moved. The valley seemed peaceful in daylight, but I never forgot that night. It was a reminder that nature doesn't negotiate or wait. It acts on its own time. When I finally hiked out, I kept looking back over my shoulder. The steep walls of the valley looked quiet and still, but I knew better now. At any moment, those rocks could come tumbling down again, and there would be nothing anyone could do to stop it. I was alone in the woods. Nothing unusual for me, really. I'd spent the weekend at the same campground before, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the trees and the occasional sound of a bird or a squirrel darting across the underbrush. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me and the wilderness for a few days to get away from everything. The kind of place where you can let your guard down, forget the noise of the world, and just be. The campsite was nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush, with a stream running just beyond the trees. I had set up my tent near a clearing, away from the main trail. I didn't mind the isolation. It gave me peace of mind, the kind of peace you can only find when you're far from civilization, where there are no people and no distractions, just the sounds of nature. The sun was low in the sky when I arrived, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I spent the evening collecting firewood and getting everything ready for the night. As the light faded and the fire grew, I cooked a simple meal, sitting close to the warmth of the flames. It was quiet, too quiet. You know that kind of silence where the sounds of nature seem distant, like they're not quite there? It was one of those nights. No rustling in the trees, no chirping of crickets, just the crackle of the fire. I sat there watching the flames dance and shift, and I felt that nagging sensation at the back of my mind. the kind you get when something feels off, even if you can't place what it is. It wasn't the first time I had spent a night alone in the woods, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the stillness of the place, the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Or maybe it was the fact that I was alone, really alone, for the first time in a long while. I shook the feeling off, thinking I was just being paranoid. After eating, I decided to take a walk. It had been a while since I'd gotten out to explore the area. My mind was restless, and a walk always seemed to clear things up. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, and I set off down the narrow trail that led away from the campsite. The air had a chill to it, a crispness that made me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The path was well worn, and the trees formed a dense canopy overhead, blocking out most of the moonlight. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the trail in front of me. I walked for about 20 minutes, just lost in the quiet of the forest, when I noticed something odd. There was a slight disruption in the underbrush to the side of the trail. Something looked out of place, like the foliage had been disturbed. Caught my attention, but it wasn't anything that would have set off alarms. Still, something in me urged caution, so I approached slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed down to get a better look. When I pushed through the branches, that's when I saw him. At first, it didn't register. I just thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then the flashlight beam landed on him, and my heart skipped a beat. He was lying there in a crumpled heap, face down. The body was sprawled across the forest floor, arms twisted unnaturally to the sides. His legs were splayed awkwardly, one bent at a strange angle. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I took a step back, then another. This wasn't right. This wasn't an animal, not even close. It was a person, a man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, dressed in a t-shirt and jeans that were torn in places, as if he had been dragged through the underbrush. His skin had a sickly, pale hue to it, and his face was streaked with dirt, his eyes wide open but glazed over. There was no sign of life in him. His mouth was slightly open, and there was something dark around his lips, a dried, crusted substance that I didn't want to think about. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind raced. I had no idea who he was or how long he had been there. My first instinct was to turn around and run back to camp, but something held me in place. I couldn't just leave him there. I had to make sure he wasn't still alive, that he wasn't just unconscious. But I knew deep down that was a lie I was telling myself. He was gone. I knelt down beside him, cautiously, trying not to touch anything. The forest seemed to press in around me, the air thick with the scent of decay. It wasn't just the body. It was the smell of something foul, something that had been left to rot in the damp earth for too long. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I reached out, hesitating just a moment before gently pushing his shoulder with the tip of my flashlight. His body was cold, colder than it should have been. He had been there for a while. I stood up quickly, a chill running down my spine. It was hard to think, hard to focus. The only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to get out of there. I needed to get back to camp and call for help. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. The way he had been left, sprawled out like that so deliberately. It wasn't just a random death. It looked like he had been placed there. Someone had done this. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't. I had to make sure it wasn't someone I knew. Maybe he was just lost, an unfortunate soul who had wandered into the woods and collapsed. But something told me it wasn't that simple. I couldn't just walk away. The path back to camp felt longer than it should have, the shadows in the trees shifting and stretching as if they were following me. The flashlight in my hand trembled, the beam wavering with every step. I was starting to panic, my breath coming in short gasps. I tried to keep calm, but my mind was filled with questions. Most of them I didn't want to answer. Who was he? What happened to him? And why the hell was he out here alone? When I finally reached the clearing, I ran straight to my tent, heart pounding, and locked the zipper behind me. I didn't care that it was just me out here. I didn't care that it was dark. I couldn't shake the image of that man's lifeless body lying in the woods. I sat in my tent for what felt like hours, too afraid to go back and investigate further, too terrified to sleep. The night dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Eventually, the sun began to rise, and I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay there another minute. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. The forest outside was eerily quiet, the same quiet that had unsettled me the night before. I walked to my car, keeping my eyes on the trail, half expecting to see something, or someone, moving in the shadows. It wasn't until I was safely in my car, driving away, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the winding road that led out of the woods. I couldn't get the image of that man out of my head, nor could I stop thinking about how his body had been so carelessly discarded in the forest, like a piece of trash left to rot. I didn't go to the authorities. I didn't report it. Couldn't. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen. I didn't have the words. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the thought that, in the end, it wouldn't have mattered. I'd seen enough death in my life to know that sometimes things happen, and you're left to deal with the consequences. But that's the thing about the woods. They hold secrets. They don't let go of things easily. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try to forget, those secrets find their way to you. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my family and I went on a camping trip that I've never forgotten. We lived in a small town, but not far from us was a little campsite we visited regularly, about 2 hours away by car. It wasn't a big, fancy campground with lots of facilities or lots of other people. It was quiet, mostly surrounded by trees, with a few dirt roads and picnic tables here and there. Over the years, my family had slowly made a spot of our own there. We'd picked a nice flat place near a small creek where we could hear water trickling at night. It was our little piece of the outdoors. The same spot had a fire pit we had made, some rocks stacked around it, and we brought old logs or cut pieces of wood to sit on. Each trip added a little more. A hammock tied between trees, a makeshift clothesline, some decorations hung from the branches. On this particular trip, we weren't alone with just our family. My aunt and uncle had to leave for military tours, so we took their 2 dogs with us. Both were bird dogs, well-trained and usually very calm and gentle, especially around kids. Their names were Star and Ariel. Star was a bigger dog with a thick, dark coat and sharp eyes that always seemed to be watching everything. Ariel was smaller but quick and very alert. Both were part of our group for this trip, and at first, everything seemed normal. The dogs played with my brothers, ran after sticks, and sniffed around the camp like they always did. The first night was chilly but peaceful. We ate dinner over the fire, roasted marshmallows, and told quiet stories under the stars. My brothers were younger, both under 10, and full of energy but also tired from the long drive. My grandma sat close to the fire, quietly knitting, while Mom checked the campsite for any last things before bedtime. The tent was big enough for most of us kids to share, and I remember the feeling of crawling inside, pulling the sleeping bags close. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the leaves, and the creek's water sounded steady and calm. Around 1 in the morning, everything changed. I was almost asleep when I heard Star growling. It was low at first, a sound that didn't seem to belong to her usual quiet nature. I sat up and listened closely. Ariel joined in with a quiet growl too. The dogs were inside the tent with us, and they never made noise like that unless something was really wrong. The growling became sharper, more focused, like they were warning us about something outside. Mom must have heard it too. She sat up immediately, reaching for the flashlight near her side of the tent. She whispered to the dogs softly, but they didn't calm down. Instead, they moved toward the tent flap and growled even louder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could see Mom unzipping the tent and stepping outside with the flashlight, and Star and Ariel followed her. But what happened next was strange and terrifying. As Mom stepped out, the dogs wouldn't let her move freely around the campsite. Both Star and Ariel got into what I now know was an attack stance. Body low, teeth showing, eyes locked on something we couldn't see in the dark. They didn't bark or rush forward, but they positioned themselves carefully. It was as if they were herding Mom away from something, keeping her in a narrow area near the car. The dogs stayed between Mom and the rest of the campsite, in front of the tent as if guarding it. They moved in a way that pushed her slowly back, not letting her cross a certain invisible line. Inside the tent, my brothers and I were wide awake now, scared and confused. The other kids around us were crying quietly. It wasn't just the dog's behavior that unsettled us. It was the feeling that something was out there, watching us, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Mom couldn't explain it then, and honestly, I don't think she understood it now. But for some reason that she can't explain to this day, she didn't hesitate. She started packing up the camp, quickly, calmly, but with a sense of urgency that made it clear this wasn't a normal situation. We got all our things packed in the car as fast as we could. The dogs stayed alert, refusing to settle, growling low and staring into the woods. Mom got us all in the car, telling us to be quiet and keep calm, though her voice was tight with tension. My brothers were still crying, and even I was trembling, trying not to think about what might be out there in the dark. We started driving away from the campsite. The narrow dirt road was rough and bumpy, but Mom kept the car steady. Star and Ariel got into the back, sitting up and growling at nothing visible through the windows. The darkness outside the car felt thick and heavy. We were all scared but trying to act brave. Mom said little, just kept her eyes on the road. About 10 minutes after leaving, a car appeared behind us. It wasn't unusual to see other vehicles on the way out of the campground at night, but something was off. The car stayed close, matching our speed exactly. The headlights were dim, but steady, and the driver didn't try to pass or turn away. The dogs began growling louder, more intense, and it was clear to everyone inside the car that this wasn't just a normal camper or someone leaving the site. My brothers were almost hysterical by now, crying and holding each other. I was trying to watch the road, but also stealing quick glances in the rearview mirror. The car behind stayed right there, never blinking, never slowing down. The tension in the car was suffocating. Mom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. As we neared the town, the road led over a huge bridge. The bridge was wide and long, crossing a river that seemed to swallow the headlights in its dark water below. Crossing the bridge felt like crossing into safety, but the car behind us didn't seem to want to let go. It stayed right there, following us as we slowly moved forward. In my mind, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the car had scared people inside too. Maybe they were just lost or trying to find their way back home. But the dogs didn't agree. They were growling and showing their teeth, staring at the windows like they could see through the night. Then, suddenly, right as we reached the middle of the bridge, the car behind us stopped. It didn't move forward or continue with us. It just stopped dead in the middle of the road behind us, then spun its wheels and took off back the way we had come, speeding into the darkness like it wanted to disappear as fast as possible. The relief that washed over us was immediate but mixed with confusion and fear. We kept driving the rest of the way into town, quiet and shaken. Once we reached the gas station at the edge of town, Mom parked the car and we all got out. The dogs stayed tense, growling softly, still alert to every sound. Mom went inside to buy cigarettes, but even then Star refused to relax. She wouldn't let Mom out of her sight and wouldn't let her get back into the car until she could see her clearly. It was as if Star was guarding her, still on high alert for something unseen. We never did find out what it was that scared the dogs so much that night. There were no signs of anyone or anything near the campsite, no footprints, no noises apart from the dogs and our own. But the feeling of being watched, followed, and threatened stayed with us all. That night changed how I thought about camping. It wasn't just about the outdoors or the fun of sitting by a fire anymore. It was about the fear of the unknown, the way the dark can hide things that don't want to be found. A few years later, another camping trip, this time closer to home, only confirmed what I already felt. I didn't want to be out there alone with just the trees and the night around me. I didn't want to hear growls or footsteps or feel eyes watching me. I still loved the woods in the daylight, but camping under the stars with the shadows lurking nearby? No, that was no longer my thing. The fear that night, the dog's warning, and the car following us. Those memories are still sharp and clear. Even now, when I think back to that trip, I remember the cold night air, the silence between the trees, the way the dogs moved and how my mom looked, calm but alert, ready to protect us no matter what. That night taught me that sometimes danger doesn't come with a warning or a reason. Sometimes it just waits, watching, and you have to trust those who know how to sense it, even if you don't understand it yourself. The night was already settling over the forest by the time I got my tent pitched. The sun had slipped behind the trees hours earlier, and now the woods were filled with long shadows and the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost like the earth itself was holding its breath. I'd arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, after a long day of hiking. My legs were sore, my backpack was heavier than I thought it would be, and my fingers were raw from setting up the tent poles. But I finally had the tent standing, my sleeping bag unrolled, and a small campfire crackling nearby. I sat back on a fallen log, pulling off my boots to let my feet breathe. The smell of pine needles mixed with the smoke from the fire. The forest was alive, but quiet. Just the rustle of leaves in a soft breeze, and somewhere off in the distance, the faint call of an owl. I'd chosen this spot because it was close to a small creek I'd passed on the way in. The sound of running water made the place feel calm. It was the kind of spot you might think was safe, remote enough to be alone but not too far from the trail. Perfect, I thought. I started to cook my dinner, some canned beans and rice heated over the fire, and ate slowly while watching the flames dance. It was almost dark now, and I could see only outlines of the trees around me. I figured I'd be tired soon enough and planned to crawl into my sleeping bag early. The sky overhead was clear, sprinkled with stars that seemed sharp and bright in the cool night air. After dinner, I spent a few minutes gathering some extra firewood. I moved carefully, stepping over roots and stones, making sure not to disturb the quiet more than necessary. The fire was small but enough to keep the chill off. The forest felt cozy at first, almost like a protective shell. But the longer I sat alone, the more I noticed the little sounds. A twig snapping here, a branch creaking there, and how quickly my mind began filling in the gaps. I told myself to relax. It was just the forest being itself. But then I heard it, a heavy breathing sound coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind messing with me, or perhaps some animal moving through the underbrush. I stopped moving and held my breath, listening closely. The breathing was low and deep, uneven, and it didn't match anything I'd ever heard from the usual forest animals. Deer, raccoons, and foxes all have lighter breaths or more sudden noises. This was different. It sounded human. I slowly reached for the small flashlight I had next to me, but I didn't want to shine it yet. I didn't want to give away my position if there really was someone out there. The breathing got louder, closer. My heart started pounding in my chest. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, something moved in the dark just past the trees. I could just make out a shape, tall, hunched slightly forward, moving with slow but heavy steps. I froze. The firelight flickered across the clearing, casting long shadows that stretched toward the tree line. My first thought was to run, but where? I was deep enough in the woods that the nearest road was at least a mile away. My phone had no signal and I had no way to call for help. I couldn't see any other campers nearby. This was my solo trip and I was completely alone. I swallowed hard and tried to keep calm. I remembered the small pocket knife I had clipped to my belt. Not much, but better than nothing. I slid my hand down to grip the handle tightly. The shape stepped into the clearing. It was a man. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his face was partly hidden in shadow. His eyes caught the firelight and gleamed sharply. He was breathing heavily, like he'd been running or carrying something heavy. My mind raced. Was he hurt? Lost? Dangerous? I didn't know. I wanted to call out, ask if he was okay, but my throat felt dry and frozen. He took another step forward, slow but steady. I saw then that his hands were clenched into fists. There was something tense about the way he moved. Not desperate or scared, but angry, maybe, or tired beyond reason. I slowly stood up, keeping my hands visible but still gripping the knife just under my fingers. I didn't want to make sudden movements or scare him, but I needed him to know I wasn't easy prey. He stopped a few feet from me and looked down at the fire. Then his eyes flicked back up to mine. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, the only sounds the crackling fire and his heavy breathing. Then he took a sudden step back and turned, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he'd come. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore. I didn't move until the fire was almost out, my mind spinning with questions and unease. Was he just a lost hiker? Someone running from trouble? Or something worse? The woods had suddenly felt much less safe. I carefully put out the fire, snuffed it with dirt, and covered the ashes. I didn't want to leave a light or scent trail that might attract him back. Then I zipped up my tent and climbed inside, pulling the sleeping bag tightly around me. I lay there, listening to the forest. The sounds seemed sharper now, closer. Every small noise made me tense. I kept my knife within reach and the flashlight ready beside me. I didn't sleep much that night. At some point, I heard the breathing again. Not heavy this time, but slower, almost deliberate. I thought I saw movement outside, shadows shifting in the moonlight. I stayed frozen, not daring to look. Hours passed. Then, before dawn, everything grew quiet again. When the sun finally started to rise, soft light filtered through the trees. I unzipped the tent and peeked out. No sign of the man. I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could. My hands were shaking. My legs still felt weak. I decided not to stay longer. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the forest seemed normal again. Birds chirping, leaves rustling softly. But I knew what I'd seen, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me all the way to my car. Driving away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me through the trees. But there was nothing. Still, I knew that the woods held stories I'd never understand. Stories of people who passed through, some lost, some running, some dangerous. And that night, I had been close enough to one of those stories to feel its weight. I promised myself I'd be more careful next time, and maybe not so alone. It was the kind of day that felt heavy before it even began. Gray skies hanging low, the air thick and still like it was holding its breath. I had driven out to the camping spot alone, leaving the small town behind as the winding dirt road took me deeper into the woods. The car's tires crunched over dry leaves, and every now and then, a cold gust rattled through the trees, making the branches creak like old bones. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but the feeling in my stomach told me something wasn't quite right. I'd picked the spot weeks ago, a small clearing beside a shallow creek that babbled quietly as it wound through the trees. It was the perfect place if you wanted to get away from everything. No cell signal, no passing cars, no people at all. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. Or at least that was the plan. When I finally parked, the engine shut off, and the silence closed in all around me. The woods felt dense, alive in a way that was hard to explain. Not like the peaceful quiet of a park or the city's soft hum. This was older, thicker, like the forest had been watching me even before I stepped out of the car. I grabbed my backpack and slung it over one shoulder. It was loaded with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I moved slowly, careful not to trip over the roots that twisted like snakes across the ground. The last bit of daylight was slipping away, the sky turning from gray to a bruised purple. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The poles were stiff and the fabric stiffened in the cold air. I worked quickly, though, knowing the dark wouldn't wait for me. Finally, the tent was up, zipped closed against the chill. I set my campfire in the fire ring nearby and lit it, watching the small flames dance as the night began to fall. The fire was comforting at first, the orange glow chasing away the shadows that gathered just beyond the circle of light. I sat close, eating some of the canned beans I'd brought, and listening to the creek. It was soothing, like the steady pulse of the woods itself. But then, the quiet began to shift. The The normal sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, started to fade. The wind died down completely, and even the creek seemed to hush. That's when I heard it. The first, just a faint noise, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze, straining to listen. There was no wind to carry sound, so whatever it was close. Very close. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam slowly over the treeline. The woods looked empty, but I could feel eyes on me. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, maybe a coyote. I'd seen tracks earlier, nothing unusual for the area. But the noise came again, louder this time. The crunch of twigs breaking, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't moving away, it was coming closer. I stood up, heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. My hands shook as I reached for the small pocket knife in my jacket. I knew I wasn't prepared for anything big. No bear spray, no gun, nothing except this little blade and my wits. The shadows between the trees thickened, and I caught a glimpse of movement. Dark shapes slipping between trunks, close enough to see the glint of eyes reflecting my flashlight. I didn't dare shout or make noise. Whatever it was watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, cold sweat running down my face despite the chill. I backed slowly toward the tent, trying to keep calm, trying to make my movements smooth and steady. The fire still flickered, but I knew it wouldn't keep anything big away for long. I grabbed the tent poles, ready to defend myself, telling myself I'd hold the line here. The underbrush crackled louder now, and the sound of heavy breathing mixed with the rustling. The night closed in completely, the trees now black towers that seemed to lean closer as the sounds grew louder. Then, something broke through the edge of the trees. A large animal, bigger than I'd expected. It wasn't a bear, though the size was close. It was a moose. At least I thought so at first. Its antlers were huge, spread out like a crown. But there was something wrong in its eyes, wild, angry. The look of a creature that didn't want me here. I'd read that moose could be dangerous when threatened, but I'd never seen one act like this. It snorted, pawing the ground, and then charged. I barely had time to react. I dropped the tent poles and ran, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The moose was right behind me, crashing through the trees with terrifying speed. Every step it took shook the ground, and the branches scraped my face as I dodged and weaved. I didn't stop running until the fire was a distant glow behind me. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed, but I dared not look back. I just kept moving toward the creek, hoping to put water between me and the beast. The sound of hooves pounding behind me finally faded. When I stopped to catch my breath, the forest was silent again, save for the creek's soft murmur. My clothes were torn, my skin scratched from branches and thorns, and I was soaked with sweat despite the cold. I crawled into the creek and sat there, chest heaving, until my shaking body slowed. When I finally stood, the moon was high, casting silver light through the trees. I made my way back slowly, following the creek to the edge of the clearing. The tent was still there, half collapsed from the wind or maybe the moose's charge. I gathered my things quickly, knowing I couldn't stay another minute. The forest had shown its true face tonight, wild, dangerous, and unforgiving. I packed what I could, leaving behind the fire ring and some gear that was too soaked or broken to carry. The walk back to my car felt endless, every noise making me jump, every shadow looking like something lurking. But finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the headlights and the familiar shape of my car. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The forest was behind me now, dark and silent again, but the memory of those eyes, the charge, the pounding footsteps, they stayed with me long after the road took me back to town. That night, I realized how fragile we are out there, how quickly the peaceful woods can turn into something dangerous. And I promised myself I'd never take that quiet for granted again. I'd been meaning to get away for a while. Work had been dragging on, the city noise was giving me headaches, and I just needed to feel quiet again. Not silence exactly, but that kind of calm you only get deep in the woods, away from everything. So I packed my gear, double-checked the weather, and drove out early on a Friday morning toward a national forest I'd visited years before. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no RVs, no loud kids playing music at 11 p.m. Just trees, wind, and time. I parked my car at the end of a gravel road and hiked in with my pack. It took me nearly 4 hours to reach the site I'd marked on my map. A flat clearing near a small stream, with thick trees all around but enough of a break in the canopy that I'd get moonlight at night. I set up camp slowly, like I always do. I staked my tent, got the fire pit arranged, and walked down to the stream to fill my water bottles and boil them on the little stove. Everything felt calm, normal. That first night went as expected. I cooked some instant noodles, sat by the fire, listened to the breeze push through the trees. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. A few moths flapped around my headlamp, and eventually I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep. It got cold around 3 a.m. like it always does in the forest, but I'd packed right, and I slept until morning light started seeping through the tent walls. The second day I spent hiking around. There was a ridge about a mile west that gave me a good view of the valley below. I stayed out longer than I planned, just enjoying the air and the quiet, but I got back in time to collect more firewood before it got too dark. That night, though, something felt different. I was sitting by the fire, adding sticks to keep it going, and I felt like I was being watched. I didn't hear anything unusual. No branches snapping, no rustling underbrush. But I kept looking over my shoulder toward the tree-line. The kind of feeling you get when someone's staring at the back of your neck. I tried to shake it off. Paranoia is normal out here, especially when you're alone. But I stayed alert just in case. I slept a little lighter that night. Woke up a few times. Once, I thought I heard something pacing outside the tent, but when I listened harder, it stopped. Could have been a raccoon or deer. The forest is full of life after all. I told myself not to let my imagination run. The next morning, I saw boot prints near my fire pit. That stopped me cold. They weren't mine. The heel pattern didn't match my hiking boots, and they weren't where I normally walked anyway. Whoever it was had stepped near the ashes, circled around the far side of the fire ring, then headed back into the woods the way they came. I didn't hear them, didn't see a flashlight, nothing, and it had rained slightly that night, just a mist, so the prints were fresh, no older than a few hours. I stood there for a long time staring at the ground. I wasn't anywhere near a trail, and I hadn't seen a soul since I left the car. There was no reason for someone to be out here in the middle of the night unless they were trying not to be seen. That was the part that stuck with me, the silence. If it had been another camper, I would have heard something. But they were quiet. I didn't pack up right away. I don't scare easy, and I didn't want to overreact, but I made sure my knife was on my belt and that my headlamp had fresh batteries. I decided to stay one more night, but moved my tent a little deeper into the trees, away from the clearing. I didn't start a fire that night, just ate a cold meal and sat in the dark with my back to a tree, listening. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps, slow, careful, crunching dry leaves one at a time, coming from the direction of the old fire pit. They weren't loud, but the forest at night is so quiet that every sound carries. Whoever it was, they were moving like they didn't want to be heard. That scared me more than if they just walked straight through the clearing. I clicked off my headlamp and stayed perfectly still. They got closer. I couldn't see them through the trees, but I could tell they were moving in an arc, like they were circling where my tent had been. Maybe confused it wasn't there anymore. My heart was pounding, and I kept my breathing as slow and quiet as I could. Every instinct I had told me not to move. I waited and waited. Then I didn't hear anything, just silence again. I stayed that way for nearly an hour. When I finally turned my headlamp on, I swept the woods in every direction. Nothing, not even the sound of retreating footsteps. It was like they disappeared into the trees. The first light, I packed up everything. No breakfast, no water refill. I just shoved it all into my pack and started hiking out. I didn't feel safe staying any longer, and I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked. A few times, I thought I heard movement behind me. Twigs snapping, quick footfalls, but when I stopped, it stopped too. I didn't run, but I moved fast, covered that 4-hour hike in about 3. When I got back to the car, I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, like I'd finally escaped something. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there with my hands on the wheel for a few minutes. My pulse was still racing, and I could feel sweat on my neck. I didn't see anyone on the way out. No other cars. Nothing. Just me and whatever had been out there with me. I didn't tell anyone right away. Felt like they'd think I was being dramatic. But a week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I called the ranger station for that area. I didn't say much, just asked if anyone had reported suspicious behavior in that part of the forest recently. The ranger hesitated, then told me they'd found an abandoned camp not far from where I'd been. Torn up tent, clothes scattered, no signs of the camper. It had been reported a few weeks earlier by another hiker who passed through. They'd never identified who it belonged to. That was the part that stuck with me. Whoever had been at my camp didn't want anything, didn't take anything. They just walked in and stood there, quiet, watching. I still go camping. I still love the woods, but now I only go with a friend. I make sure to stay near trails near other people. I don't go that deep anymore, and I never camp in the same spot twice. Whatever that was, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was just a person. But that's what makes it worse, because people can wait, they can follow, they can hide in the dark and not say a word, and you'll never know what they wanted, or how close they came, until it's already over. I decided to go camping alone in north-central Pennsylvania, deep in the woods where few people ever went. It wasn't the kind of trip I took lightly. I needed to get away from everything. People, noise, all the distractions that filled my daily life. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be so far from civilization that the only sounds were natural. No phones, no cars, no other voices. I didn't pick a marked trail. Instead, I drove down rough forest roads until I found a narrow, barely noticeable path leading into the trees. It wasn't much more than a faint break in the brush, and spiderwebs caught on my sleeves as I stepped onto it. The trail twisted through thick undergrowth, alongside a small creek that babbled over rocks and roots. I figured following the water would keep me from getting lost. The hike was harder than I expected. The ground was uneven, covered with roots and slippery leaves. I had to climb over fallen logs and dodge thorny bushes. Every step took focus. The sun dipped low as I moved deeper, and the forest grew darker. I kept checking over my shoulder, but there was no one else. No footprints, no sounds of other hikers. After 6 or 7 miles, I found a small clearing just across the creek. The ground was flat and mostly clear of underbrush, a perfect spot to set up camp. But as I crossed the creek on slick stones, I noticed something odd. Scattered gear, clothes soaked and tangled in the brush, a dented metal mess kit, empty food wrappers, cans, and a torn first aid kit. Someone had been here recently. There was no backpack, though, just the stuff they'd used left behind. Nearby, a pile of damp clothes hung from a low branch, smelling sour with mildew. A stone fire ring sat cold and unused. Off to the side, I spotted something that stopped me cold. A crude wooden cage made from thin saplings tied together, about 4 feet square. It was too fragile to hold anything, but it was deliberate, carefully constructed. I didn't know what to think. Someone had camped here, maybe for days or weeks. The ground around the fire ring was trampled, and an area near the edge of the clearing was littered with used toilet paper. Dozens of wads partially buried under leaves. Whoever had been here hadn't just passed through. They'd stayed for a while. That night, I set up my tent facing the creek. I kept my knife close. The wind rustled the leaves, and every crack or snap in the dark made me jump. I didn't start a fire or cook. I ate a granola bar and drank water. I told myself the noises were just animals, squirrels, raccoons, maybe a deer. But the abandoned gear and that strange cage made me uneasy. Around midnight, I stepped outside the tent and shone my flashlight around. The beam caught the damp clothes, the fire ring, and the cage. No signs of anyone else, no fresh tracks. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, I packed quickly and left without eating. I crossed the creek one last time and kept looking back, half expecting to see someone watching. But there was only silence. The hike back felt twice as long. I moved faster, constantly alert. When I reached my car, I didn't breathe easy until I was back on the paved road, surrounded by other cars and people. I called the Forest Service and told them what I'd found. They said they'd check it out. Maybe someone living off the grid, they said. Maybe a hunter or someone who'd run off for a while. But I never forgot that night. It wasn't the forest that scared me. It was the thought of someone else, living unseen, leaving behind the signs of their story but nowhere to be found. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the absence of something I couldn't understand. Now when I go camping, I still love the woods, but I don't wander off trails alone. And I never camp near someone else's abandoned things. Because sometimes, the scariest part of the wilderness isn't the wild animals or the dark. It's what people leave behind. I remember the first time I went camping alone in the backcountry. It wasn't planned like most trips with friends or family. This was something I decided to do on my own, to test myself, to find some quiet away from everything. I picked a spot deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, where no one would stumble across me by accident. The kind of place where cell service was a joke and the only light at night came from stars. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, some food, water purifier, map, compass, and a headlamp with extra batteries. I left early in the morning and hiked for hours along a narrow dirt trail that twisted through thick pine and fir trees. The air was cool and smelled like moss and damp earth. Every now and then, I heard the faint crack of a twig underfoot or the rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted away. The forest felt alive but peaceful. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing next to a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. Flat ground for the tent, plenty of dry wood nearby, and the sound of water nearby was calming. I set up my camp slowly, taking my time to make sure the tent was secure and the fire pit was safely built. As the sun lowered behind the trees, the shadows stretched long, and the temperature dropped. I put on a jacket and started a fire, letting the warmth seep into my hands. Cooking a simple meal over the flames felt good. The crackling fire and the soft gurgle of the creek were the only sounds around me. I watched the sun disappear completely, and the sky shifted from deep orange to dark blue. Stars began to flicker, sharp and bright through the clear night air. I sat close to the fire and ate slowly, enjoying the silence. Then, as darkness fully settled in, the forest's other noises woke up. In the distance, I heard an owl's hoot, low and mournful. Somewhere closer, maybe 100 yards away, a branch snapped sharply. I froze for a moment, heart beating a little faster. It was nothing I could see, just a sound. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal moving through the brush. I cleaned up, put out the fire carefully, and zipped myself into the tent. The night was cold, colder than I expected, and the quiet inside the tent felt heavy. I lay on my sleeping pad, trying to relax, but every small noise outside made me tense. There was something about being alone out there that sharpened every sound, every rustle. I was fully aware that I was miles from help. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off, I heard something else, a low, deep grunt. Not a sound I recognized. It was close, very close, right outside the tent. My breath caught, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then there was a slow, heavy step, the brush parting slightly. I didn't move or make a sound. I knew I had no idea what was there, and the last thing I wanted was to provoke it. The step stopped right next to the tent. For what felt like an eternity, the silence was thicker than before. Then I heard heavy breathing. It was steady, calm, but close enough that I could almost feel it through the thin fabric of the tent wall. My mind raced, thinking of everything I'd read about animals in these woods. Bears, mountain lions, even wild boars. None of it helped. The breathing stopped. Then more footsteps, heavier, moving slowly away. I stayed still, too scared to even breathe deeply. I wanted to wait until I was sure it was gone. But sleep didn't come that night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the soft morning light, but I saw the signs: large, deep footprints in the dirt near the fire pit, too big to be a deer or any small animal. I traced them to the edge of the trees and saw more prints disappearing into the underbrush. My stomach tightened. I packed up quickly, keeping my eyes peeled as I moved. I didn't want to stay one more night. I hiked out fast, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the main trail, I felt relief wash over me, but also a strange sense of respect for the wild I'd been so eager to conquer. Every summer, my church group would go camping together for 2 weeks. It wasn't some spiritual retreat or anything. We weren't constantly praying or doing church activities. It was just a chance for us to be together in the woods, to bond over hikes, games, and the peace that came from being away from everything. We were a group of people who, despite not having much in common, somehow found connection through these trips. And it had become a tradition. I was 16 at the time, the oldest in our group. I was used to being the one who looked out for others, though I didn't always like it. I guess that's just what happens when you're the oldest. It becomes your role whether you want it or not. The younger kids looked up to me, and the counselors often relied on me to keep an eye on the others. I didn't mind. I'd been going on these trips since I was a kid, and I was familiar with every rock, every tree, and every trail in the area. 1 week into our trip, the counselors decided to play a game. They set up stations throughout the woods, each with its own mini-challenge. The idea was to walk through the forest, stopping at each station to complete a task. Some of the tasks were simple, like throwing a ball into a target or balancing on a log, while others were more difficult, like climbing over obstacles or carrying heavy items. My group was up first. We started off easy enough, crossing a small creek. It wasn't deep, maybe just knee-high, but it was slippery and had a strong current after the rain the night before. We had to hop across the rocks, making sure we didn't lose our balance and fall into the water. I was in the back, so I watched as the others made it across. I carefully took my time, balancing myself, making sure my feet found solid ground. Once across, we continued our trek, climbing a steep hillside. It was hard work, but nothing I couldn't handle. The hill was long and covered with loose dirt and small rocks that crunched underfoot. I had to pause a couple of times to catch my breath, but eventually, we made it to the top. The next challenge was to carry a tree trunk from one point to another. It wasn't a large trunk, but it was heavy. There were 6 of us, so we took turns carrying it back and forth, trying to see how many times we could do it before we got too tired. It was exhausting. The sun was high, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. My muscles were sore, and the air felt thick and heavy. Despite the heat, I pushed through. I didn't want to be the one to complain, the one to slow down the group. Then something happened. As I lifted the trunk for what felt like the 100th time, I twisted my ankle. I didn't even see it coming. 1 second I was steady, the next I was on the ground, clutching my ankle in pain. My first instinct was to try and get up, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot up my leg, and I immediately realized that something was wrong. I stayed there for a second, hoping that the pain would subside, but it didn't. I tried to put weight on my foot, but I couldn't. I looked up at the group, but they hadn't noticed. They were all focused on the trunk, busy with the task at hand. They were ahead of me, and I was still on the ground, unable to move. I could hear the laughter and voices in the distance, but it felt like I was in my own little world, isolated by the pain. I tried to stand up again, this time more carefully, but the moment my foot hit the ground, the pain surged through me and I collapsed back down. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself not to cry. I was the oldest, I had to be tough. Crying would only make it worse. I couldn't be the one to show weakness. So, I limped to the group, taking it slow, trying not to let them see how much pain I was in. When I finally caught up to them, I collapsed onto the ground and looked at my ankle. It was swollen and it was getting worse by the second. I tried to move it, but the pain was unbearable. My counselor, who was about 17 at the time, walked over. She looked at me with concern, but she didn't say much. She was a little overstrained herself, trying to manage everything and everyone. She didn't know what to do, so she called Mark, our camp leader, to come and look at it. We sat there for what felt like forever, waiting. The rest of the group was still finishing their task, unaware of what was happening with me. I stared at the ground, trying to stay calm, trying not to panic, but my mind was racing. I had to get back to camp. I had to be okay. What if this meant I had to leave? What if my parents found out and I had to go home? I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. When Mark finally showed up with another counselor, they both looked at my ankle and decided that they needed to get me down the hill. The other route would have been 2 kilometers long, but the one we took was much shorter, only 5 minutes away by foot. The problem was that I couldn't walk. I was in too much pain to even stand, so they decided to carry me. I don't remember much of the walk down. I think I was in shock. My mind was fuzzy, my body exhausted. I had my eyes closed most of the time, trying to block out everything around me, but the ride was anything but smooth. The path was rocky and uneven, and every bump seemed to send a shock of pain through my body. I could feel the cool breeze against my skin, and I heard the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling, but it all felt so distant. I couldn't concentrate on anything except the throbbing in my ankle. At one point, we came across another group and we stopped to rest. My friend was with that group, and later, she told me that I wasn't responsive at all. I didn't react to anything they said. I just stared straight ahead, blankly. Felt like I was in a dream. Nothing seemed real. The next part of the journey was when I started to panic. We had to cross the creek again, and I knew that wasn't going to happen. The water was moving faster now, and the rocks were slippery. My 2 counselors were exhausted from carrying me, so they switched out with 2 others. I was scared, I'll admit it. I didn't want to fall into that water. I didn't want to make things worse for myself or for anyone else. I just wanted to get to the car, get to the hospital, and know that everything would be okay. Eventually, they managed to get me into the car, and we drove to the nearest hospital. I don't remember much of the drive. I was so focused on the pain in my leg that I didn't really pay attention to anything outside the window. The city was much bigger than the camp area, and it was so different. The noise, the people, the lights. It all felt so overwhelming after the quiet of the woods. At the hospital, they did the usual tests. X-rays, checking my pulse, asking me questions I didn't really want to answer. I just wanted them to fix my ankle. The doctor looked at the results and casually told me that I had torn my cruciate ligament. It was bad, he said. I needed to give myself injections in my belly every day to manage the pain and prevent further complications. I was shocked. I thought it was just a sprain, but it was so much worse. My mind raced. I was going to be stuck on crutches for the rest of the trip, and I felt a heavy sense of guilt. I should have been tougher. I should have been stronger, but there was nothing I could do now. When I returned to camp, I was given crutches to help me get around. It was a strange feeling, being the one who needed help for once. I wasn't used to being dependent on others. The counselors had to carry me sometimes, or help me move from place to place. It was a weird experience. I'd known these guys since I was 11, but being carried like that felt so foreign, so vulnerable. I didn't like it, but I stayed. I stayed for the rest of the week, despite everything. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to finish what I had started. My parents never fully realized how bad my injury was. They thought I was just being dramatic, but it was real. It was terrifying. By the end of the week, I had learned something that I still carry with me to this day. Life is unpredictable. You can be strong one moment and helpless the next. You can't control everything, no matter how much you want to. I learned to accept help when I needed it, to rely on others when I couldn't do it alone. And that's a lesson I'll never forget. I was alone in the woods. Nothing unusual for me, really. I'd spent the weekend at the same campground before, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the trees and the occasional sound of a bird or a squirrel darting across the underbrush. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me and the wilderness for a few days to get away from everything. The kind of place where you can let your guard down, forget the noise of the world, and just be. The campsite was nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush, with a stream running just beyond the trees. I had set up my tent near a clearing, away from the main trail. I didn't mind the isolation. It gave me peace of mind, the kind of peace you can only find when you're far from civilization, where there are no people and no distractions, just the sounds of nature. The sun was low in the sky when I arrived, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I spent the evening collecting firewood and getting everything ready for the night. As the light faded and the fire grew, I cooked a simple meal, sitting close to the warmth of the flames. It was quiet, too quiet. You know, that kind of silence where the sounds of nature seem distant, like they're not quite there? It was one of those nights. No rustling in the trees, no chirping of crickets, just the crackle of the fire. I sat there watching the flames dance and shift, and I felt that nagging sensation at the back of my mind, the kind you get when something feels off, even if you can't place what it is. It wasn't the first time I had spent a night alone in the woods, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the stillness of the place, the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Or maybe it was the fact that I was alone, really alone, for the first time in a long while. I shook the feeling off, thinking I was just being paranoid. After eating, I decided to take a walk. It had been a while since I'd gotten out to explore the area. My mind was restless, and a walk always seemed to clear things up. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, and I set off down the narrow trail that led away from the campsite. The air had a chill to it, a crispness that made me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The path was well worn, and the trees formed a dense canopy overhead, blocking out most of the moonlight. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the trail in front of me. I walked for about 20 minutes, just lost in the quiet of the forest, when I noticed something odd. There was a slight disruption in the underbrush to the side of the trail. Something looked out of place, like the foliage had been disturbed. Caught my attention, but it wasn't anything that would have set off alarms. Still, something in me urged caution, so I approached slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed down to get a better look. When I pushed through the branches, that's when I saw him. First, it didn't register. I just thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then the flashlight beam landed on him, and my heart skipped a beat. He was lying there in a crumpled heap, face down. The body was sprawled across the forest floor, arms twisted unnaturally to the sides. His legs were splayed awkwardly, one bent at a strange angle. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I took a step back, then another. This wasn't right. This wasn't an animal, not even close. It was a person, a man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, dressed in a t-shirt and jeans that were torn in places, as if he had been dragged through the underbrush. His skin had a sickly, pale hue to it, and his face was streaked with dirt, his eyes wide open but glazed over. There was no sign of life in him. His mouth was slightly open, and there was something dark around his lips, a dried, crusted substance that I didn't want to think about. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind raced. I had no idea who he was or how long he had been there. My first instinct was to turn around and run back to camp, but something held me in place. I couldn't just leave him there. I had to make sure he wasn't still alive, that he wasn't just unconscious. But I knew deep down that was a lie I was telling myself. He was gone. I knelt down beside him, cautiously, trying not to touch anything. The forest seemed to press in around me, the air thick with the scent of decay. It wasn't just the body. It was the smell of something foul, something that had been left to rot in the damp earth for too long. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I reached out, hesitating just a moment before gently pushing his shoulder with the tip of my flashlight. His body was cold, colder than it should have been. He had been there for a while. I stood up quickly, a chill running down my spine. It was hard to think, hard to focus. The only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to get out of there. I needed to get back to camp and call for help. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. The way he had been left, sprawled out like that so deliberately. It wasn't just a random death. It looked like he had been placed there. Someone had done this. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't. I had to make sure it wasn't someone I knew. Maybe he was just lost, an unfortunate soul who had wandered into the woods and collapsed. But something told me it wasn't that simple. I couldn't just walk away. The path back to camp felt longer than it should have, the shadows in the trees shifting and stretching as if they were following me. The flashlight in my hand trembled, the beam wavering with every step. I was starting to panic, my breath coming in short gasps. I tried to keep calm, but my mind was filled with questions. Most of them I didn't want to answer. Who was he? What happened to him? And why the hell was he out here alone? When I finally reached the clearing, I ran straight to my tent, heart pounding, and locked the zipper behind me. I didn't care that it was just me out here. I didn't care that it was dark. I couldn't shake the image of that man's lifeless body lying in the woods. I sat in my tent for what felt like hours, too afraid to go back and investigate further, too terrified to sleep. The night dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Eventually, the sun began to rise, and I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay there another minute. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. The forest outside was eerily quiet, the same quiet that had unsettled me the night before. I walked to my car, keeping my eyes on the trail, half expecting to see something, or someone, moving in the shadows. It wasn't until I was safely in my car, driving away, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the winding road that led out of the woods. I couldn't get the image of that man out of my head, nor could I stop thinking about how his body had been so carelessly discarded in the forest, like a piece of trash left to rot. I didn't go to the authorities. I didn't report it. Couldn't. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen. I didn't have the words. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the thought that, in the end, it wouldn't have mattered. I'd seen enough death in my life to know that sometimes things happen, and you're left to deal with the consequences. But that's the thing about the woods. They hold secrets. They don't let go of things easily. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try to forget, those secrets find their way to you. Camping was something my family did every summer when I was growing up. It wasn't a question of if we were going, just a matter of where. We'd load up the car with tents, tarps, coolers, food bins, sleeping bags, and whatever else my parents decided we needed that year. Sometimes it was Virginia Beach, sometimes Westmoreland, which I always dreaded. It had these swampy parts, bugs the size of your thumb, and it just smelled like hot plastic and mildew all the time. But then there was Assateague, which was a different kind of wild. You had the beach, the breeze, the salty air, and the ponies. Real, actual wild ponies. That summer, I think I was maybe around 9 or 10. Old enough to understand what was going on, but still young enough that things could easily scare me if they caught me off guard. We got to the campground in Assateague sometime in the afternoon. The sun was still high, the wind kicking up little bursts of sand in the parking lot. You could smell the sea even before you could see it, and I remember feeling excited when we parked the car and started unpacking. It was hot, humid, but the kind of heat that comes with a breeze that almost makes it feel like a reward. You sweat, but then the wind hits you and you think, yeah, this isn't too bad. We picked a campsite that was closer to the beach than usual. My parents liked hearing the waves at night, and I liked that you didn't have to walk as far to get to the water. There was a little dune just past our site, and from the top, you could see the ocean stretching out, endless and gray-blue, with sunlight flashing off the surface like broken glass. We brought 2 tents that year, a larger dome tent for my parents and me, and a smaller one for extra storage or changing clothes, or sometimes my older cousin if he came with us. But that trip, it was just the 3 of us. We set up the main tent closer to the trees and the smaller one maybe 30 or 40 feet away, near where the sandy path dipped toward the beach. The day was pretty uneventful. We grilled hot dogs, ate chips, and got sand in everything. I ran up and down the beach, chased a few crabs, and tried to skim stones into the waves even though the surf always swallowed them before I could tell if I was doing it right. The sun eventually dropped behind the dunes and turned everything golden for about 10 minutes before the sky started going purple and then dark. Campfires flickered around the other sites, and the air filled with the sound of wood crackling, people laughing, bugs buzzing. At night, the beach gets quiet. There's this stillness to it that's only broken by the wind and the waves. You don't get city noise out there. No cars, no phones, just nature doing its thing. That night, I remember the fire dying down slowly. My dad poked at the coals with a stick while my mom packed away what food was left. Then we turned in. I fell asleep to the sound of waves and the faint rustling of the wind tugging at the tent's rainfly. The fabric swayed gently in and out, like the whole thing was breathing. It felt safe, like being wrapped in a soft, warm bag. I always liked sleeping in the tent, even when it got cold, because it felt like a little house just for us. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. The kind of deep, middle-of-the-night dark that feels heavier than just the absence of light. The moon must have been out, though, because I could see shapes and shadows inside the tent. At first, I wasn't sure what woke me. Everything was still. I didn't hear anything obvious. No crack of branches, no footsteps, nothing that would normally pull someone out of sleep. But I was awake, and I felt that creeping sense that something was just a little bit off. It took me a second to realize my mom was sitting up. Her sleeping bag was pulled back, and she was completely still, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't shaking me or talking, just sitting there staring. That's when I noticed her head was turned toward the mesh window of the tent. I followed her gaze and saw it too. There was a figure outside, right up against the tent wall, just on the other side of the mesh, maybe a foot away from where we were sleeping. It looked like a woman, an old woman, thin, with long hair that moved slightly in the breeze, almost like it was floating. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline in the moonlight. Her posture was bent slightly forward, like she was leaning in to see inside. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat and just sat there, thudding hard. I felt cold even though it was warm in the tent. I didn't know what I was looking at, but everything about it felt wrong, like I'd woken up in a dream that was already halfway to being a nightmare. My mom didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared. I remember whispering to her, not loud, just enough to make a sound. But that was enough. The figure flinched, then moved, fast. Not like a person, not really. It was lower to the ground than I expected, and the way it moved, there was no sound of footsteps. Just this rustling, like brush being pushed aside. Then the shape was gone. My mom finally turned and looked at me. I don't remember if she said anything. I just remember both of us staring at the mesh, then out into the night. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I didn't want to go back to sleep. Every shadow seemed sharper now, every noise louder. I heard a soft thud somewhere outside, like hooves on packed sand, and for a second, I didn't understand what I just heard. Then it clicked. My mom opened the tent and stepped out with a flashlight, and I followed, more out of fear of being left alone than anything else. The beam of light cut across the sand and trees, and that's when we saw them. Ponies. Wild, feral ponies, just casually making their way down the narrow path toward the beach. There were 4 of them. One had a coat so light it looked white in the moonlight, its mane long and tangled. That was what I'd seen, what we both saw. The old woman was a pony, standing close to the tent, probably trying to sniff around for food. Its long mane hanging down had looked like wiry hair. Its posture, hunched and strange in the shadows, had looked human only because my brain had filled in the blanks wrong in the dark. The campsite had been set up right across one of their trails. We didn't know it, or maybe we hadn't paid enough attention when we were setting up the tents, but that's what it was. The ponies were just following their regular path down toward the water. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They probably didn't even know we were there until they got too close. Eventually, we went back into the tent. My mom zipped it up, checked the snacks were packed away in the bins outside, and lay back down. I stayed awake longer, just listening to the ponies walking past, their soft hooves padding in the sand, the occasional snort or shake of their manes. I could still picture the shape in the window, the silhouette that had looked so much like something else. It was a long time before I fell asleep again, and even then, I kept waking up to the slightest sounds. But by morning, everything looked normal again. Just another bright, hot day on the island. The ponies were gone, probably grazing in the brush somewhere farther down. Our tent had faint hoof prints near it, soft dents in the sand like they had stopped and lingered for a while before moving on. We ate breakfast, packed up a few things, and went down to the beach. The water was cold that morning, colder than I remembered it being the day before. I didn't say anything about what happened that night, and neither did my mom, but I kept looking over at the trail, watching for movement in the brush. That night stuck with me, though, not because anything bad actually happened, but because of how real the fear had felt, even when the truth turned out to be something ordinary. It taught me how the mind fills in gaps when it doesn't have all the information. In the dark, a pony becomes a person. A shadow becomes a threat. Your own imagination can trip you up worse than anything else out there. And after that trip, we always checked where the trails were before pitching our tents. I grew up way out in the woods. Our house wasn't off-grid or anything like that. We still had plumbing, lights, hot meals, the usual comforts, but we were tucked back far enough from town that our neighbors were more likely to be deer or coyotes than other people. There was one long gravel driveway that cut through the trees and curved past a shed before reaching the house. Beyond that, there were acres and acres of woods, sloping hills, brush, and old trails that looked like they hadn't seen a vehicle or even a boot in years. It was the kind of place where if you screamed as loud as you could, no one outside your own house would hear you. It didn't bother me back then. In fact, I think I liked it more because of that. Everything felt bigger and wilder, but also familiar, like our own private world. We used to have these camp-outs, not real backpacking trips or anything hardcore, just kids camping in the backyard or out a little farther into the trees. We'd pitch cheap dome tents or just bring sleeping bags and roll them out on a tarp under the stars. There was always a cooler filled with soda, a pile of firewood someone's dad had helped chop, and maybe some half-burnt hot dogs or marshmallows to go with it. Sometimes we stayed just behind the house where the porch lights still reached if you squinted, but other times we went farther, into that part of the woods where you couldn't see the glow of the house anymore, where everything started to feel different. Still, the house was technically close. If we really needed to, we could run back inside for the bathroom or more snacks. That mix of comfort and wilderness made it easier to do stupid stuff and not feel like we were really in danger. One of our favorite games was Manhunt. It was basically hide and seek, but we played it at night, out in the woods, and only one person, the hunter, was allowed to have a flashlight. Everyone else had to sneak around in the dark, crouch in bushes, hide behind trees, or lay flat in leaves trying not to breathe too loud. The hunter would shine their flashlight around and try to catch us by sight, tagging us out if we were seen or heard. It was a mix of terror and excitement, especially with the forest around us soaking up sound, distorting distance. You'd swear someone was right behind you, only to find out they were 100 feet away. We played every time we had a camp out. It became a tradition. One night, when I was probably around 10 or 11, we were doing one of those deeper campouts, not super far from the house, maybe 5 or 6 minutes of walking through the trees, but far enough that we couldn't hear anyone if they called from the porch. It was a warm night, late summer or early fall, with a clear sky and a big, bright moon. The moonlight filtered through the leaves and lit up the forest floor enough that you could see the shapes of things but not the details. We didn't even use tents that night, just laid out sleeping bags in a half circle and had a fire going in the middle. I remember someone had brought kettle corn and a deck of cards, but most of us were too hyper to sit still and play anything calm. After it got dark enough, we started up Manhunt again. The group was probably 6 or 7 of us. A mix of boys and girls, a little older and younger, mostly kids from around the area. We picked the hunter, gave them the flashlight, and counted out loud while everyone else scattered. I took off with 2 other kids. I think their names were Jamie and Drew, but I can't really remember anymore. And we headed deeper into the woods, away from the fire and the faint glow it cast between the trunks. We crouched behind a big fallen tree that had probably been dead for a decade, its bark all soft and peeling. The leaves underneath us were dry and crunchy, so we tried not to move too much. We could hear the others laughing and whispering nearby as they found their own hiding spots, the hunter's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a slow-moving lighthouse. We stayed there for a while, long enough that the air started to feel colder, and the silence of the woods settled back in. You could hear night bugs buzzing, maybe a distant owl. No one had been caught yet, or at least we didn't hear anything that sounded like someone being tagged out. Every now and then, the beam of the flashlight passed nearby, and we ducked our heads. But it never got too close. I remember whispering something to one of the kids with me, probably something dumb, like whether we should move closer to the fire or try to sneak up behind the hunter. We were starting to get bored. Then we heard something that didn't make sense. Came from behind us, not the direction of the fire, not where the hunter had been. This was coming from deeper into the woods. There was a faint sound at first, rustling leaves. It wasn't fast or loud, just steady, like footsteps. It didn't sound like an animal. There was too much purpose to the movement, like it had weight and direction. It wasn't darting around or hopping from branch to branch like a squirrel or a raccoon. It was just moving forward, quietly, but not silent. We all froze. I remember the exact moment my stomach dropped, like I just realized I forgot to turn in a homework assignment. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe the hunter had circled around somehow. Maybe someone else decided to double back. But no one ever came from that direction. That part of the woods was thick and tangled. We avoided it even in the daytime. It didn't have trails. It wasn't easy to walk through. If you went that way, you had to bushwhack, and you'd make a lot more noise than that. Then we saw it. A small beam of light. It flickered between the trees, unsteady, low to the ground. It wasn't the hunter's flashlight. That one was bigger and brighter. This looked like one of those tiny pen lights or maybe even a phone screen. It was jittery, like someone holding it in a shaky hand. We didn't say anything. No one whispered, no one asked questions. We just looked at each other, all thinking the same thing without having to speak. We ran. All three of us stood up at the same time and just bolted, not even caring how loud we were or if the hunter saw us. We crashed through the leaves and branches, not looking back. I could hear the other two behind me, feet pounding the ground, breathing hard. My heart was slamming in my chest. I didn't stop to check where the light was or if it was following. I just ran toward where I thought the house was, hoping I was going the right way in the dark. We screamed the whole way, not words, just pure noise. It wasn't planned. It was like our bodies were trying to get the fear out any way they could. I remember the sting of branches whipping across my arms and face, the way my feet slipped on dry leaves and almost sent me sprawling. We didn't stop until we broke through the trees and saw the fire again, still burning low in the clearing. A couple of the others were there, confused and wide-eyed, and the hunter turned their flashlight toward us. We didn't explain. We didn't try to make sense of it. We just stood there, out of breath, hearts pounding, and waited for the woods to go still again. The flashlight beam didn't appear again. No footsteps followed us. Whatever it was, if it was anything at all, it didn't come after us. We stayed close to the fire the rest of the night. Some of the others were annoyed we ruined the game, but once they saw how pale we were, they stopped teasing. We didn't go back into the woods that night. Instead, we laid our sleeping bags near the edge of the clearing, closer to the house. I think I barely slept. Every time the fire crackled or a branch snapped somewhere in the distance, I jumped. The next day, we didn't talk about it much. I don't think we wanted to. Maybe we all knew it was probably nothing. Some guy walking his dog with a flashlight. A neighbor out for a night walk. Someone from town who got turned around. Or maybe it was another kid trying to sneak up on us, though I don't know how they'd have gotten out there without us hearing. Still, it wasn't like they chased us or tried to scare us. If anything, I bet we scared them. A bunch of kids suddenly jumping up and screaming at the top of their lungs in the middle of the woods would freak anyone out. Even though it scared the hell out of me at the time, it didn't stop us from playing manhunt. We still did our camp outs. We still hid behind trees and waited for flashlights to pass. But I never went back to that same spot again. And every time I hid out far from the fire, I kept one ear turned toward the trees, listening for footsteps that didn't belong. Now that I'm older, I look back on it differently. I don't think it was anything malicious, just bad timing and fear mixing together in the dark. But that moment stuck with me. How quickly the woods can go from feeling like your backyard to something completely unknown. Something that doesn't care how old you are or how close the house is. When you're out there, even just a few steps too far, everything feels bigger and quieter and darker. And when something unexpected happens, even something small, your mind fills in the blanks with the worst thing it can imagine. It's funny how those childhood memories linger. That feeling of running blind through the woods, every instinct in your body screaming at you to move faster, even though you don't really know what you're running from. That moment when the light didn't look right, when the sound didn't fit. It was probably harmless. I'm almost sure of it now. But in that instant, it felt like something out of a nightmare. And I guess that's what made it stick. Even now, if I walk outside at night and hear rustling in the trees, my mind still goes back to that night. I remind myself it's just the wind, or a raccoon, or maybe someone out late with a flashlight. But for a second, that old feeling creeps back in. The same one I felt as a kid crouched behind that log, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. And sometimes I still feel the urge to run. The sun had barely risen when we gathered in front of my house, ready for our annual camping trip. It was the 1st of May, the day we always marked for our tradition, and this year was no different. We'd been planning it for weeks, each of us contributing to the usual haul of food, drinks, and camping gear. As always, a few of us stopped by the convenience store to grab some beer for the road. The plan was simple: head to the same camping spot we'd been to a dozen times, deep in the woods, set up camp, and drink until the sun went down. It was the kind of trip where we could just let loose, have fun, and forget about everything else for a while. By 5 a.m., everyone was packed into the car, bags full of stuff, and our spirits were high. It was still chilly outside, and the sun hadn't quite come up yet, but it didn't matter. We were used to the early mornings, the long drive, and the excitement of reaching our destination. It was tradition, and no matter what, we kept it. We drove through the countryside, the roads lined with the kind of greenery that always made me feel at ease. We passed the town and headed further out, deeper into the forest. When we finally reached the campsite, it was still relatively quiet. A few other cars were parked nearby, people unloading their gear and setting up their own spots. But we didn't pay them much attention. Everyone else was there for the same thing, enjoying the outdoors and having a good time. The sun was starting to warm the air as we set up our tents. We got a fire going, the smoke rising into the clear sky, and cracked open the first beers of the day. As usual, the whole group was in high spirits, laughing, joking, and just enjoying the moment. The spot we picked was nestled in the woods, just far enough from the other campers to feel like we had some privacy. But even so, we could still hear faint music in the distance from the other side of the campsite. It was nothing unusual, just some people playing music to keep themselves entertained, like we were. Hours passed. The day turned into late afternoon, and we found ourselves with empty cans scattered around the campfire. The music from the other campers had been playing pretty steadily throughout the day, but as the sun started to dip behind the trees around 7 or 8 p.m., the music suddenly stopped. At first, we thought nothing of it. We figured the people near us were just winding down for the night, maybe getting some sleep. It wasn't uncommon for people to pack up and leave on the night of May 1st, since most of them were only there for the day. But we were staying for the whole weekend. Around that time, one of my friends, Jake, said he was going to go over and ask if anyone had a lighter. We'd forgotten to bring one, and he thought it wouldn't hurt to check with the nearby campers. He wandered off in the direction of where the music had been, but when he came back a few minutes later, he looked kind of surprised. "They're gone," he said, shaking his head. "I went over there, and no one's around. Everything's packed up. They must have left early." We all stood there for a moment, trying to process what he said. It didn't make sense. Normally, people stuck around at least until the 2nd of May, and we'd never seen anyone leave that early. But we shrugged it off. Maybe they just had somewhere else to be. Jake found a lighter, and we got the fire going again. It was starting to get dark now, the kind of dark where the trees almost swallowed up the light, and the air had that cool, crisp edge to it. We cracked open more beers and kept talking, trying not to think too much about the weirdness of the situation. The night carried on as normal, the sound of our laughter and conversation filling the space around us. But around 10 p.m., something changed. We heard it at first, a faint sound off in the distance, something like a giggle, the high-pitched laughter of girls playing in the woods. It wasn't unusual to hear people messing around in the dark, but the way it sounded made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound like normal laughter. It was distorted, like something was off, and it wasn't just the laughter. We started hearing footsteps, quick, light steps, like someone was running through the forest. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. It didn't make sense. There was no one around, and even if there had been, no one would have been running like that in the woods. Felt wrong. What the hell was that? Someone asked. It's probably just some drunk people screwing around, Jake said, trying to brush it off. Let's just keep drinking. We passed the beers around again, the laughter coming easier now as we tried to ignore the strange sounds. But the noises didn't stop. The running footsteps grew closer, and the laughter kept echoing through the trees, each time a little more distant, but still there. We'd drunk enough to feel pretty buzzed by now, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Something didn't sit right about it. At this point, everyone was on edge, trying to act casual but feeling uneasy. The air around us felt thicker, like the forest had become a different place altogether. Then, we heard something even worse. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming towards us from the trees. They weren't fast or light like the running from earlier. These were slow, deliberate steps, like someone or something was walking toward us. Everyone immediately tensed up. We grabbed anything we could find, shovels, knives, sticks, and we prepared ourselves. We didn't know what we were going to face, but we weren't going to be caught off guard. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. We waited, hearts pounding in our chests, the crackling fire the only sound in the air. I swear, for a moment the whole forest went quiet. There was no sound of wind, no rustling of leaves, just absolute silence. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. But then, the silence was broken by a snap of a twig somewhere to our left. We all jumped, our eyes darting to the darkness. We stood there for a long time, listening. The footsteps didn't return. It wasn't until we started to settle down again that we heard them once more, coming from the edge of the camp. They were getting closer. We all stood up, ready to fight whatever was out there. But again, nothing came. The footsteps stopped just out of view, and no one emerged. We kept quiet, waiting in the dark. We knew there was something out there, but whatever it was staying just far enough away that we couldn't see it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the laughter, everything. It all went quiet. By the time we decided to try to get some sleep, we were all exhausted, but the tension in the air didn't let up. We lay in our tents, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the only thing that kept us from thinking too much about what had happened. Still, no one slept well that night. Every little noise had us on edge. A branch breaking, a distant snap of a twig. It all made us jump. When the morning came, we were all awake before the sun even rose. We were too afraid to stay in the tents any longer, and we all piled out, looking around. But there was no sign of anyone. No one had been there. The campsite was as quiet as it had been when we first arrived, and the tracks we thought we'd seen in the ground were gone. We looked for signs of whoever or whatever had been around us, but there was nothing. No footprints, no traces, just the quiet of the forest. As we packed up to leave, none of us said much. We all knew what we had experienced, and though we couldn't explain it, we were all shaken. That night, whatever had been in the woods with us wasn't human, and we were lucky that it didn't come any closer. To this day, we've never talked about it much. Maybe we were all just drunk, maybe we heard things that weren't there, but something happened that night, and none of us will ever forget it. Even now, I can't help but wonder if we were just a little too close to something we shouldn't have been. I went camping alone in the northern part of Idaho, close to the Canadian border, late in the season. It was already October, Most people were done with the camping season by then. The air had that sharp chill even during the day, and at night it dipped into freezing temperatures. I'd gone solo camping a few times before, but this was the first time I chose a place so remote, a couple miles off the Forest Service Road, deep in the Panhandle National Forest. I had no real reason for picking that spot. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, away from people, away from work, away from the constant ping of my phone. The forest up there is dense. Pine, cedar, firs, all packed tightly with a thick understory of shrubs and downed trees. Even in the daytime, it feels shadowy under the canopy. I parked at the edge of the Forest Service Road, where a turnoff led to an old logging trail. The trail had clearly not been maintained in years. Deep ruts, moss growing between the tire tracks, fallen branches and leaves half burying it. I hiked in with my gear on my back. I had a tent, a 0-degree sleeping bag, a jet boil, food for 5 days, and all the other standard stuff. I even had a bear canister and bear spray. I knew that grizzlies were less common that far north, but they weren't unheard of, and black bears were definitely around. I walked for about 2 hours until I found a clearing just large enough for my tent and a small fire pit. The land sloped gently to the west, and through the trees I could see glimpses of a small, stagnant pond about 100 yards down the hill. There was no wind, just the occasional creak of trees moving subtly against each other. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, every step, the faint sound of water dripping somewhere off a branch. I pitched the tent, set up camp, gathered firewood, and got settled. By dusk, the fire was going, and I was eating a pouch of beef stew warmed over the jet boil. The first night was uneventful, cold, still. I kept hearing what I thought were raccoons moving around, small animals digging through leaves. Once, there was a louder thump a few yards away, but I didn't move. I stayed zipped up in my sleeping bag and just listened, my breath fogging the inside of the tent. When I woke up the next morning, there were no tracks around the site, not even deer, just a thick carpet of pine needles and frost. I spent most of that day exploring the area, walking down to the pond, then bushwhacking around it until I found the outlet stream, which was barely a trickle. The water was still and dark. I saw no fish, no frogs, no bugs. It was the quietest body of water I'd ever stood next to. There were a few animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe a fox, but nothing recent. It felt untouched, like no one had come near it in weeks or more. I walked further that day, just exploring, enjoying the solitude. I didn't bring my phone, just a topographic map and compass, though I knew my general location by memory and landmarks. By the time I got back to camp in the late afternoon, the temperature had dropped again, and a thick mist was creeping through the trees. I built the fire higher that night, collected extra wood, and sat beside it until the stars came out. Then I doused it, made sure all my food was back in the bear canister, and went to bed. I woke up around 3 a.m., not to a sound, but to a feeling like something was wrong. I listened for a while. Nothing. Just the usual distant creaking, a few pine cones falling. I must have dozed off again eventually. In the morning, I noticed something odd. Some of the branches I'd collected for firewood had been disturbed. Not moved far, just scattered slightly. At first, I thought maybe I had done it myself without realizing. But it didn't look random. A few of the longer pieces were laid out almost in a line. I shook it off. Maybe I'd knocked them over when I came back in the dark. I made coffee, ate oatmeal, and decided to hike further out that day. There was a ridge line I wanted to check out. It had a partial view of the valley, and I thought I could get a better sense of the land. I packed a day bag and left camp mid-morning. I was gone for most of the day, maybe 6 hours. I got back just before sunset and noticed it again. The wood. This time, some of it was gone, like someone had taken a few pieces, or maybe I'd miscounted. I stood there staring at the pile for a long time, trying to figure out if it made sense. Could an animal be taking it? But what animal collects cut branches and drags them off? They weren't food and they weren't chewed. The ground was too hard to see clear tracks. I felt that tightening in my chest again, the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept the fire going until midnight, sitting close, listening. Nothing happened. No sounds. No movement. But I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd snap them open again at the slightest sound. The next morning, I decided to stay near camp. I didn't want to be away in case something or someone was messing with my gear. I spent the day cleaning up, gathering more wood, boiling water to refill my bottles. Around noon, I found fresh tracks about 30 feet from camp. They weren't mine. I was sure of it. They were larger than mine, wider, and they came from uphill, stopped near the fire pit, then looped back the way they came. I stared at them for a long time. My heart was pounding. I didn't know if they were from a hiker, a hunter, or someone else, but they were recent. The edges were sharp, no debris fallen into them yet. I tried to tell myself it could be a forest ranger, but that didn't make sense. There were no tire tracks on the Forest Service road when I hiked in. No sign of anyone else for miles. And what ranger comes within 30 feet of someone's camp and doesn't say anything? That night, I hardly slept. I kept the fire burning long past midnight. I kept my bear spray and hatchet beside me inside the tent. I listened for hours. Just past 3 a.m., I heard something. A crack of a branch, then a few slow steps. Not fast, just slow, deliberate movement maybe 20 feet away. I held my breath. Then nothing. No more steps. Just dead silence. My hand was gripping the can of bear spray so tightly it hurt. I waited, every muscle tense. After maybe 15 minutes, I whispered to myself to stay calm, to stay still. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. By morning, I was already packed. I didn't cook breakfast. I didn't make coffee. I just rolled everything up, shoved it into my pack, and started hiking out. I kept checking behind me. Every half hour, I'd stop and listen. Once, I thought I saw something off to the right between the trees. A flash of movement. Maybe an animal. Maybe not. I didn't stop to check. I reached the Forest Service road around noon. My car was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and drove for over an hour before I let myself relax. I didn't realize until I was almost back to town how tense I'd been. My shoulders were cramped, my neck stiff. I kept thinking about the tracks, the wood pile, the movement in the dark. And worst of all, I knew that whoever or whatever came near my camp had to have stood there, quietly watching, not attacking, not stealing, just standing, waiting. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone might have been watching me in the woods? It wasn't a crime. It wasn't even a clear threat. But it was real. It happened. I haven't been solo camping since then, and I haven't gone back to Idaho. I still think about it sometimes. How silent the woods were, how the pond had no sound, how whoever it was never tried to speak or make contact. Just came close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. Sometimes that's worse than anything else. Knowing someone is out there, just past the tree line, silent and still, watching. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. I'd been feeling drained from work, staring at screens too long and answering emails that never seemed to stop. I needed to be outside, away from traffic, people, and the constant noise. So, I packed up my gear on a Friday morning, filled a cooler with food, grabbed my sleeping bag and tent, and headed out. I chose a remote state forest I'd been to a couple of times before. Nothing popular. No campgrounds with toilets or water spigots, just rough trails and cleared out spots deep in the woods where few people go. That was exactly what I needed. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Once I passed the last small town, cell signal disappeared, which was fine by me. The roads narrowed into gravel, then dirt, and eventually I parked the truck beside a small stream where the trailhead began. From there, I hiked in 2 miles. It was late afternoon by the time I found the clearing I remembered. A wide patch of flat ground surrounded by pines, the forest floor thick with pine needles. A few large rocks lined the edge of the clearing. You could hear a stream off in the distance. Felt quiet, peaceful. Nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I set up my tent near a fallen log, cleared a fire ring, and started boiling water for dinner. I wasn't worried about animals. I knew there were black bears in the area, but I'd brought my bear canister and kept all food and scented items packed away. I ate dehydrated chili mac while the sun dipped behind the trees, then built a fire and sat in front of it until the stars came out. It was the kind of night you imagine when you think about solitude. No light pollution, just the crackle of fire and the occasional rustle of wind high above. I slept okay that night, not great. The forest was quiet, maybe too quiet at times. I woke up around 3 a.m. to what I thought was a snapping twig, but after listening for a while, there was nothing else, so I chalked it up to a dream or an animal far off. I got up the next morning feeling better. I boiled coffee, stretched, walked to the edge of the clearing to relieve myself, and noticed something strange. The edge of the trail, about 50 yards down from where I'd come in, had a patch of turned up dirt. Fresh, like someone had dug there and covered it up sloppily. The color of the soil was different from the forest floor, darker, wetter. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a bear digging for roots or a den. But when I walked closer, I saw small bits of torn-up cloth half buried in the dirt. It didn't look like old camping gear or trash. It looked more like clothing, thin, torn nylon, maybe part of a jacket or backpack. Something didn't sit right with me. I felt that low stirring in my gut, a kind of heaviness that slowly creeps into your thoughts when something doesn't make sense. I walked back to camp, told myself not to worry, and decided to do some hiking during the day to get my mind off it. I hiked about 6 miles that day, followed a small trail down to the stream and back, climbed a ridge that gave me a view of the forest canopy, ate lunch on a boulder with my boots off. The sky was clear, blue as I'd seen in weeks, but I couldn't shake that unease from earlier. Something about that patch of dirt bothered me. It didn't look natural, and the way it was positioned, off the side of the trail, hidden slightly by some brush, seemed intentional. It was like someone had tried to cover something up and done a poor job of it. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I checked again. I used a stick to poke around the loose dirt, pushing aside some of the debris. There were more cloth scraps buried beneath it, some small pieces of what looked like foam padding, maybe from a backpack strap or sleeping pad. I didn't dig further. I felt like I was crossing some line, but something told me that whatever was buried there didn't belong, and I started to feel very exposed. I decided not to stay another night. I packed up quickly, not panicking, but moving with purpose. I didn't like how my skin felt cold and damp even in the sunlight. The air felt heavier, like it had changed. I put out the fire, double-checked the area, strapped on my backpack, and started back down the trail toward my truck. It should have taken me about an hour to reach the parking area. The trail isn't complicated, it winds a bit but stays relatively clear. About halfway through, I stopped. The trail had fresh footprints. Boot prints like mine but larger. Not mine. They were newer than the ones I made coming in. I crouched to look closer. The tread was deeper, more defined, and they were spaced wide apart, like whoever made them was walking quickly. They followed the trail in the direction of my camp. I hadn't seen anyone on my hike that day. No voices, no distant movement. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing but wind in the branches, distant bird calls, the usual forest sounds. But the sense of unease grew stronger. My mouth felt dry, my ears strained for anything unusual. I kept walking, faster this time, looking over my shoulder every so often. I didn't want to run. Running felt like a bad idea, like it would trigger something I didn't understand. But I wanted to be gone. I wanted my truck, locked doors, and a road that led back to town. When I finally reached the clearing where my truck was parked, the first thing I noticed was that my cooler was gone. I had left it in the truck bed, strapped down with a bungee cord. The bungee was still there, but the cooler was gone. That made my heart pound. I walked around the truck slowly. No broken windows, no other damage, just the cooler gone. I climbed in, locked the doors, started the engine, and backed out without checking the mirror. The drive out felt longer than it should have. The road twisted more than I remembered. The trees looked darker. The shadows stretched across the ground like they were following me. I didn't stop until I reached pavement again. Once I had signal, I pulled over and called the non-emergency number for the sheriff's department in that county. I explained about the dug-up dirt, the cloth scraps, the footprints, the cooler. They said they'd send someone to check it out, asked me to give coordinates and details, which I did. They didn't seem overly concerned. Maybe they get a lot of weird reports like that. I didn't hear anything for a week. Then, I got a call from a deputy who said they'd found what looked like remnants of old camping gear buried there. Nothing dangerous, just trash someone had tried to get rid of. I asked about the footprints or the missing cooler. They didn't have anything to say about those. Said there wasn't enough evidence to look further. I let it go, but it didn't sit right. 2 months later, I saw a story online. A small blurb buried on a local news site. A missing hiker's backpack had been found in that same state forest, about a mile from where I'd camped. The article said he'd gone missing the previous fall. No details, no follow-up. But the timing made sense. The clothes buried in the dirt, the foam padding, the footprints, the cooler gone. Someone had been out there watching maybe. Maybe they didn't like that I found something I wasn't supposed to. I haven't gone back to that forest since. I still go camping, but I stick to areas with other people nearby. Not because I'm scared of the woods. I know how to handle wildlife, bad weather, even getting lost. But people are different. You never know who's out there or what they're hiding. And sometimes, when you stumble on something you weren't supposed to see, the smartest thing you can do is leave it alone. Walk away, pack up, get out before whoever buried it comes back. I still think about that trip sometimes. Not in nightmares, not even in fear, really. More like a lesson, a quiet one. The forest doesn't have to be haunted to be dangerous. All it takes is one person hiding in the trees, waiting, or maybe just watching. And when you're that deep in the woods, nobody's going to hear if something goes wrong. That's what stuck with me. That silence. How complete it was. How the forest doesn't care what happens in its shadows. That's why I don't camp alone anymore. It had been a long, exhausting day at school. I had that kind of deep-in-the-bone tired where your body just sort of moves on autopilot, dragging itself home. I didn't have the energy to talk to anyone, didn't even want to think. Like I usually did when I wanted to drown out the world, I put in my earbuds, turned my music up high, and started the walk home. The air was crisp and cool, not cold, but just enough to remind you that fall wasn't too far off. I had picked out an outfit that morning that I liked, a skirt with a pair of tight shorts underneath, some thigh-high stockings and sneakers. Nothing crazy, nothing fancy, just something I felt comfortable in. I had a hoodie tied around my waist and my bag slung over my shoulder. I wasn't paying attention to much, just counting the steps, zoning out, nodding slightly to the beat of the music. Maybe that's why I didn't notice him right away. At first, I thought it was just someone passing close to me. A brush of air near the back of my thighs made me glance over my shoulder, but I saw nothing, just the empty sidewalk and the occasional car crawling by. I kept walking. Then it happened again. The feeling wasn't strong, just a faint push of air, like someone moving a bit too close. But this time, I turned my head a little more, and I saw him. He was no more than 2 inches behind me. His face was blank, but his eyes were locked on me. I could feel the shock freeze me for a second, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, even through the music. I yelped, more of a scream than anything, and jumped forward. He immediately looked flustered, like I had caught him doing something he hadn't planned to be seen doing. He mumbled something I couldn't hear and walked quickly past me. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but he wasn't old. Maybe in his early 20s. A hoodie, jeans, scuffed shoes. Nothing that would have stood out otherwise. I stood still for a moment, watching him walk away, my breath shaky, and every hair on my body standing up. Something about the whole thing just didn't sit right. I replayed it in my head over and over as I kept walking. The way he was close, way too close. The weird wind feeling. The angle of his eyes. Was he trying to look up my skirt? That had to be it. I felt gross even thinking about it, and the more I thought, the worse it felt. I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was overthinking. I stopped off at a small park on the way home, just to take a breath. I sat on a bench, letting my music roll on, but I kept the volume lower now. I was watching everyone. Every stranger seemed suspicious. I kept checking over my shoulder, heart still ticking a little too fast. Eventually, I forced myself to head home. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the road, and the cool air was starting to bite. I passed through the gates to my apartment complex, walked up the familiar gravel path, and came to my building. My apartment was on the second floor, just above the communal mailboxes. The staircase that led up to my door was wooden with slats in between each step. You could see right through them from below. That's when I noticed him. A guy was leaning under the staircase, not standing, not exactly hiding, but sort of hunched against the side of the stair structure, like he was waiting for someone or maybe just killing time. He was wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up and basketball shorts. At first glance, I thought maybe he was just a neighbor, maybe someone new who moved in. But something about the way he looked up at me, it wasn't casual. His head was tilted just slightly forward, his eyes following the curve of my legs as I walked. I told myself to ignore it, not to give him the satisfaction. I kept my pace, went up the stairs, and as I reached the top, I had that uneasy itch between my shoulders again. I turned slightly and looked down through the slats of the stairs. He had moved. He was now standing directly underneath the staircase. From that angle, he could see straight up through the gaps. His head was tilted back, and he had his phone out. I could see the camera app open. He was trying to take pictures. My blood ran cold. I fumbled for my phone. My apartment lock was controlled through an app. It was usually smooth, but today, of all days, it wouldn't connect. I was standing there, just feet from safety, unable to open the door, with some pervert literally trying to photograph under my skirt from below. Panic settled in fast. I pressed the lock icon again and again, but nothing happened. I turned off my Wi-Fi, tried my mobile data. Nothing. My fingers felt numb, and the lock just blinked red. I crouched down, careful not to expose myself further, and looked under the stairs. He was still there. Worse, he had pulled down his shorts. His hand was moving, and I didn't need to guess what he was doing. He was masturbating under my stairs, right under me. I backed away from the stairs, trying to stay out of view. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, to hit him, to run, but I felt frozen. My whole body was shaking, my hands cold and clumsy. I slid down to the floor just outside my door, staying low, trying to think, trying not to cry. I called my dad. I didn't know what else to do. My voice was shaky and low as I told him what was happening. He said he'd call the police. I should have done that first, but my brain was fogged over. I kept whispering to myself, trying to keep calm. A few minutes passed. I didn't dare look again. I sat tucked against the wall, listening for footsteps or any movement. The worst part was the silence. Just the occasional distant car, maybe the rustle of a leaf, but nothing from under the stairs. I knew I had to move. I couldn't just sit there all night. My phone still wouldn't unlock the door. I remembered the community office at the front of the complex. It usually had staff inside, and maybe someone had a landline or could help me. I took a deep breath, made a plan. I'd go fast, no hesitation. I grabbed my bag tight and got ready to run. I pushed off the floor, dashed down the stairs 2 at a time, and he wasn't there. Gone. Just like that. I didn't stop to wonder where he went. I sprinted down the gravel path, feet slipping slightly, and made it to the community office. My heart was racing so hard it felt like it might tear itself out of my chest. There were people there, other residents, staff. I felt like collapsing. My dad had gotten the door unlocked remotely by the time I got back, and the police came about half an hour later. They took my statement, asked a lot of questions. Description, time, actions, what he looked like. I answered the best I could, but I was still shaking. They said they'd keep an eye out, but nothing ever came of it. They never caught him. It's been months. I haven't seen him since. I changed the way I dress when I walk home. I keep my phone charged and ready. I don't play music anymore on the walk. I look over my shoulder every few seconds. I double-check the lock on the door. Nothing ever happened after that night, but that doesn't mean it's over. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I don't know if it was random or if he had followed me before, but I remember how it felt. The cold, the helplessness, the disgust, the fear, and I don't think that feeling will ever go away. I went camping alone once, thinking I needed a break from everything. Work, my phone, the noise of the city, even friends. I hadn't taken a real break in a long time, and I thought a weekend by myself, deep in the woods, would be the perfect way to reset. I wasn't new to camping. I'd been doing it since I was a teenager with my dad, and later on with friends. I knew how to pack light but smart, how to build a fire, filter water, and read a map. I wasn't some guy blindly wandering out there. I picked a spot I'd never been to before, though. A place I'd heard about from someone at work. A guy who liked to go off-grid and said this one area about 3 hours from the city was beautiful, remote, and quiet. He'd gone with a group, but I figured I'd be fine solo. I didn't expect trouble. I left early on a Friday morning. The sun was just rising, and the air still felt cool even though it was summer. I had my backpack in the back seat, filled with my tent, sleeping bag, a small camp stove, dehydrated food, a good first aid kit, extra clothes, and some emergency supplies. I also brought a hatchet, a good fixed blade knife, a compass, and an old map of the area that looked like it had been printed in the 90s. I downloaded a few offline GPS maps on my phone, too, but I didn't plan on relying on it. There was almost no service out there anyway, and I liked it that way. The drive took longer than I thought. After 2 hours on the highway, I turned onto a 2-lane road that wound deeper into the forest. After another 40 minutes, I hit a gravel road with no signposts. I only knew it was the right turn because the map said so. From there, I drove slowly, dodging potholes and tree branches that scraped the sides of my car. I parked at a small pull-off where the road just stopped. There were no other cars there, which made sense. This wasn't a popular trailhead. I hiked in about 4 miles before I stopped. The terrain wasn't rough, but it was remote. The trail was narrow and covered in pine needles, and it felt like nobody had walked it in a while. My boots left clean prints in the dirt, and I didn't see any other tracks except for deer. I found a clearing by a small creek, flat and surrounded by tall pines and fir trees. It looked like the kind of place that should have been in a brochure. The water in the creek was clear and cold, and the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. I dropped my pack, took a deep breath, and felt that peace I'd been hoping for. I set up my tent near the tree line, far enough from the creek to stay dry if it rained, but close enough for easy water access. I gathered dry wood and built a small fire pit using stones I found nearby. By late afternoon, I had camp set up, firewood stacked, and water filtered. I cooked one of my freeze-dried meals over the little stove and sat on a log, watching the fire burn low as the sky changed colors. I remember thinking it was the quietest place I'd ever been. When night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I crawled into my sleeping bag with a headlamp and read a bit from an old paperback I'd brought. After about an hour, I shut it off and just laid there, listening to the dark. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or a rustle in the brush, but that's normal. Deer, raccoons, sometimes even foxes or coyotes passed through. It didn't bother me. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. It was dead silent, like someone had hit mute on the forest. Not even wind. My body felt stiff from the cold and the hard ground, but I didn't move much. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just that feeling like something had changed. Like the environment had shifted in a way my brain hadn't caught up with. I listened, and at first I heard nothing. Then, far off, I heard what sounded like a single footstep. Just one. It was faint, like something had stepped on dry leaves. Then nothing again. I told myself it was probably a deer or something rooting around. I laid there another 10 minutes, not moving, just breathing slow and listening. My heart had started beating a little faster, but I forced myself to calm down. I eventually drifted back to sleep. In the morning, everything looked normal. The sun was out, and there was dew on the grass. I boiled water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided I'd do a little exploring. I packed some essentials into a day pack, water, first aid, knife, compass, and followed the creek upstream. I didn't bring my phone. It was dead anyway. I figured I'd hike a couple miles, find a good overlook or something, and head back by afternoon. The forest was thicker on that side of the creek. The trees were older, with heavy moss hanging from branches and thick undergrowth in places. I had to push through ferns and step over fallen logs covered in mushrooms and lichen. About a mile in, I came across a trail. Not a real one, but more like a game trail. It was narrow and faint, like something had been using it for a while, but not often. I followed it for about 10 minutes before I started noticing something strange. There were branches broken at shoulder height, fresh, with green still showing in the cracks. Not the kind of breaks that happen from wind or snow. These were clean, deliberate. Then I saw claw marks on a tree, deep and wide, with bark peeled back in long strips. I stopped and stared at it for a while. It didn't look like bare marks. I'd seen those before, and they tend to go high up on the tree, vertical. These were diagonal and low, about chest height. That's when I started to feel like I shouldn't be there. The air felt heavier, like everything had just gone still. I turned around and started heading back, following my own tracks in the dirt. I didn't rush, but I moved faster than before. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I kept glancing behind me. Every so often I thought I heard something, like footsteps, again faint, and then stopping when I stopped. When I got back to camp, it was early afternoon. My fire pit was still intact, my gear untouched. Nothing looked wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the rest of the afternoon closer to camp, sharpening my knife, checking my gear, gathering more firewood. I wanted to stay busy. I considered packing up and heading out, but the hike back was long, and I didn't want to get caught on the trail at night. I figured I'd stay one more night and leave early in the morning. That night, I made sure my fire was bigger. I built it up with dry pine and fir and let it burn hot. I even dragged a few extra logs nearby so I could keep it going longer. I sat close, eating another freeze-dried meal, watching the darkness beyond the fire. The sounds of the forest had returned. Crickets, frogs, wind in the trees. I started to relax again. Maybe I just spooked myself earlier. Around midnight, I was still awake, still sitting by the fire. I had a stick in my hand, poking at the embers, when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was deliberate, a slow crunch of something stepping on dry ground. Then another. It came from just beyond the light of the fire, somewhere near the tree line. I froze. My heart started pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. I didn't move. I stared into the darkness, trying to see if something was out there. Then the sound stopped. I waited a full minute, two. Then I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just branches and shadows. But the feeling, that gut-level alarm, was back. I threw a big log on the fire and backed into my tent, zipping it up and keeping the flashlight in my hand. I didn't sleep much. Every sound made me flinch. Every gust of wind made me grip the knife I'd placed beside me. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was just barely light out. The fire was out, the woods were quiet, and my body was sore from how tense I'd been. I packed up fast, took down the tent, rolled up my sleeping bag, stuffed everything in my pack. I didn't even eat. I just filtered water quickly, grabbed a protein bar, and started hiking out. About a mile down the trail, I stopped. In the dirt, ahead of me were prints. Not animal prints, boot prints. They weren't mine. I checked. My soles had a distinct tread pattern. These were different, wider, heavier, and they were fresh. I hadn't seen them on the way in. That meant someone had been there since I'd arrived. I followed them for a few feet. They'd come from the direction of my camp, then turned off the trail into the woods. No markings, no obvious reason to be there. I didn't follow them. I kept walking, faster now. My eyes kept scanning the woods. I didn't feel safe until I saw my car again, still parked where I left it. I threw my pack in the trunk and got inside, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I drove the whole way home in silence, checking the rearview mirror more than I should have. That feeling, like I'd been watched, didn't leave me for days. When I got back to the city, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker, maybe a hunter, but I never heard a gunshot, and there were no signs anyone had set up camp nearby. No rappers, no signs of a fire, nothing. And that game trail, it didn't feel like something used by animals. I never went back to that place. I still camp, but not alone. Not anymore. I learned that just because a place looks peaceful doesn't mean. We used to go on this fall retreat every year. It was kind of a tradition, something our company encouraged and helped organize. An outdoor weekend for employees and their families at a camp tucked away deep in the countryside. It was usually a nice break from work, some time to be with the kids, get out of the city noise, and spend time with people we didn't often see outside the office. They held it at this rustic camp about 2 hours from home. Most years we bunked in the communal cabins like everyone else, those big wood lodges with rows of beds and screen windows that never fully kept the cold out. But the year this happened, we'd had a good run. Business was strong, bonuses had been generous, and we decided to treat ourselves a little. Instead of bunking with 20 other people, my husband and I rented a camper for the weekend. The camper was nothing fancy, but to us it felt like a luxury. It had working AC, clean linens, privacy, and best of all, a door that locked. It wasn't huge, but it had enough room for the two of us and our 3 girls, all under 10 at the time. The RV rental place offered a deal that made it cost the same for 3 nights as for 2. So even though the retreat officially ended on Sunday afternoon, we decided to keep it until Monday and spend an extra night at the site. We figured we'd take our time packing, maybe enjoy a quiet evening after the crowd left, and return the RV on our way back home. The retreat itself was great. The weather, oddly enough, was hot for fall, mid-80s during the day, and sticky at night. A lot of the other families complained about the heat and the bugs, but we had the little AC unit running in the camper and it was a godsend. The kids stayed busy with games and crafts. We did the usual hiking, campfire, and potluck dinners. I don't remember anything unusual about those couple of days. Everything felt normal. If anything, better than usual because we had our own little space to come back to each night. The RV was parked along the far end of the campsite loop, a bit downhill from the main lodge and activity area. A few other people had their campers nearby, but by Sunday afternoon, everyone had cleared out. People packed up and left quickly, waving goodbyes and honking as they drove off. By 5 in the evening, we were the only ones left. That's when we started noticing the smell. It was faint at first, just a sour, swampy odor near the bathroom. We assumed it was the heat. Maybe the tanks needed to be flushed. But by 6 o'clock, it was unbearable. The stink came in waves, and every time we flushed, the water in the toilet came up a little higher. Something was definitely wrong with the septic lines. My husband got worried the rental company would think we caused it, so he decided to drive to the Walmart in the next town to pick up some drain cleaner and gloves to try and clear it. I remember looking at the clock. It was 8:30 p.m. when he pulled out of the gravel loop and onto the road, headlights swinging across the empty trees. He said it would take about an hour round trip, maybe a little more. The back roads around the camp were slow, narrow, and poorly marked, and Walmart was the only store open that late in a rural area like that. Once he left, I started cleaning up. I rinsed dishes from dinner, packed our extra clothes back into the duffel bags, wiped off surfaces, and checked the bedding. The kids were still full of energy from the weekend, bouncing between tired and overstimulated. It took me a while to get them settled. Even though it was past bedtime, I got them all into pajamas, brushed teeth, and eventually coaxed them into their bunks. I remember giving the youngest a glass of water and tucking her in again after she got up for the 3rd time. It was a little after 9:15 p.m. when the camper finally fell quiet. I sat on the bed in the back of the RV, propped up with a pillow, reading a book. It was dark outside by then, but the camper had a few little lights over the bed and in the kitchen. I left one on above the kitchen counter. The curtains were drawn, but the back window behind me had a thin blind that didn't fully close. I wasn't worried. We were on private land, the kind of place where you're more likely to run into a deer than a person. No one else was supposed to be there, and we'd never had a single safety issue in the years we'd attended. About 20 minutes passed like that. I had just started to relax when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It came from the window right behind my head. A soft, deliberate clicking. It was rhythmic, like something lightly tapping the glass. I froze. It wasn't loud, just enough to catch my attention. I sat up slowly, heart thumping, and listened. Came again. Click, click, click. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a tree branch was swaying in the breeze. Maybe a beetle or a bird had landed there. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially not with the kids asleep just a few feet away. Then it stopped. I held my breath, staring at the shadowy slats of the blinds, waiting. Nothing for several seconds. Then a new sound, the tiniest scrape, like metal on metal, against the back wall of the RV. Not loud, careful, controlled. I stood up, trying not to make noise. My bare feet were silent on the camper floor. I padded forward into the kitchen, reached into the drawer, and pulled out a long knife I'd used earlier to cut fruit for the girls. As I turned to go back toward the bed, I heard another sound. This one came from the main door, near the front of the camper. The handle moved. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the wind. It rattled like someone was trying to open it, twisting, jiggling, testing. Then another scrape, metal against the lock. I crouched low, breathing fast, and backed up into the loft area above the truck cab where the girls were sleeping. My hand was sweaty on the knife handle. I looked around the camper as best I could from that angle, checking the windows, the side door, and the emergency exit. Everything was closed. I double-checked the latch on the small loft window and gently nudged it to make sure it was locked. It was. I didn't dare make a sound. I kept the knife close and pressed myself against the mattress between my daughters, not moving. My eyes kept darting toward the side window above the kitchen. I thought I saw movement, just the faintest shift of a shadow across the blind, but I couldn't be sure. I pulled my phone from the counter and opened it. No signal. I tried again. Nothing. The bars flickered but wouldn't hold. The camp Wi-Fi didn't reach this far down the loop, and cell service was always spotty in the woods. I waited like that for what felt like forever. My heart pounded so loud it seemed impossible that whoever was outside couldn't hear it. I didn't hear the handle again, but I heard footsteps. Faint crunches in the dirt outside, moving slow and careful. They circled the RV once. I followed the sound in my head. First the back wall where the bedroom was, then the driver's side, then the front passenger side. The camper creaked slightly as they passed by. Then nothing, just silence. I kept listening, straining every muscle to pick up sound. But the only noise after that was the low hum of the fridge and the occasional settling of the camper. 5 minutes passed. Then I saw headlights. I felt this wave of relief so sharp it made my knees go weak. The soft white beam of our car's headlights twisted through the trees, then swept across the gravel road leading into the loop. I recognized the way the light curved and bounced. My husband was back. I didn't move until I heard his key in the door and the hinges creaked open. The second he stepped inside, the warmth and familiarity of him just standing there in the camper made me let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. He looked confused, even a little amused when he saw me crouched in the loft with the knife. I tried to explain what I'd heard, what I thought had happened, but he brushed it off. He said I'd probably heard an animal. We were in the woods. There were raccoons and possums and who knows what else. The smell in the bathroom had only gotten worse, so he went straight to work pouring cleaner down the pipes and fiddling with the valves under the sink. I stayed quiet, still shaken, still clutching the knife. He didn't say it, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. We spent that last night in the camper. I didn't sleep. Every sound made me sit up. I kept my phone close, checked the locks 3 times, and didn't close my eyes once. In the morning, we woke up early, ate a quick breakfast, and drove into town to return the RV. It was a small rental place near a gas station, run by a local family. The lot was dusty and full of older campers. We pulled in and parked. My husband went inside to handle the paperwork while I started gathering up our things. A few minutes later, he came back with a man from the rental office. The guy walked slowly around the RV, clipboard in hand, doing the usual once-over for damage. Everything looked normal until he reached the back. He paused. I came around the corner just in time to see him frown and point at the rear window. The rubber gasket around the window had been sliced. Not torn or worn, cut. Clean, deliberate slashes. The window lock was damaged, too. Scraped, bent slightly, like someone had tried to force it open with something thin and sharp. There were gouges in the paint under the window, as if a blade had slipped. More marks along the door frame where someone had tried to wedge something between the lock and the jamb. The guy looked up at us and asked if we knew what had happened. My husband went pale. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the marks,